Lillian Harper hit her knees on that railroad platform before the echo of the train whistle even died. Her sewing box, her mother's sewing box, had shattered open across the boards, spools rolling toward the boots of men who only stepped back to avoid her. Every single person on that platform watched. Some of them laughed. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry stood 10 feet away with his arms crossed and a grin spreading slow across his face like something ugly finding sunlight. Not one soul moved to help her until Benjamin Carter did. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every single week I bring you stories just like this one. Stories about courage, love, and the kind of choices that change everything. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay right here, because what Benjamin Carter did next stunned an entire territory into silence, and this is only the beginning. The summer of 1884 had baked Red Hollow, Montana, down to its bones. The kind of heat that made men short-tempered and horses restless and women press damp cloths to the back of their necks and pray for evening. The railroad platform outside town was no relief raw wood planking that had been soaking up July sun since before noon, radiating heat upward through boot leather, making every man standing on it shift his weight and squint and wish he was somewhere else. Benjamin Carter was not the kind of man who wished he was somewhere else. Benjamin Carter was the kind of man who decided where he was going to be and then went there and stayed until his business was finished. He stood near the far end of the platform, hat pulled low, thumbs hooked in his belt, watching the supply cart being unloaded from the third car back. Flour, wire, lamp oil, 2 crates of tools he'd ordered out of a catalog 6 weeks ago. He wasn't paying attention to the crowd gathering near the passenger cars. People gathering in Red Hollow usually meant gossip or trouble or both, and Benjamin had no appetite for either. He heard the laughter before he turned around. It started low one man, then two, and spread the way bad news always spreads in a small town, fast and greedy, feeding on itself. Benjamin turned his head just enough to see what was happening, because a man who ignored that kind of sound entirely was a man who ended up surprised by something he should have seen coming. What he saw stopped him cold. A young woman was on her knees in the middle of the platform. She couldn't have been past 25. Brown hair pinned up under a travel hat that had seen better days. A gray dress that was clean but worn thin at the elbows. Hands pressed flat against the wooden boards as she tried to gather the pieces of a shattered sewing box that had burst open when it hit the ground. Spools of thread were rolling in every direction. A small pair of scissors. Scraps of fabric. A thimble spinning on its edge before it tipped and went flat. And beside her, tipped on its side, a worn leather suitcase with a cracked brass clasp. A small Bible, black cover, sitting in the dust at the edge of the platform like somebody had dropped it on purpose. Maybe 40 people on that platform and not one of them bent down. A man standing nearest to her broad-shouldered, dressed well. The kind of man who wore his money on the outside, so nobody would have to guess, had his arms crossed, and was grinning the way some men grin when they've decided they're done with something and want everybody to know it. Benjamin knew that man. Nathan Whitlock owned a boarding house in town and a piece of the Mercantile, and had the habit of talking about both more than was necessary. He'd heard months back that Whitlock had arranged a mail-order bride, written letters out east, made promises, done the paperwork. Benjamin had thought nothing of it at the time. It was Whitlock's business. It didn't feel like Whitlock's business anymore. "Go on, pick it up," Whitlock said, loud enough for the crowd. You want to know how she showed up, folks? I'll tell you exactly how she showed up. The woman she hadn't looked up yet kept her hands moving over the boards, trying to gather the scattered pieces of her sewing box, fingers shaking. "I wrote to a woman with property," Whitlock announced. "I wrote to a woman with a dowry. I made an arrangement, a legal and binding arrangement. And what walks off that train?" He gestured at her like she was something left behind by accident. "Nothing. She's got a Bible and a busted sewing box and that suitcase which I'd wager holds about 3 dresses and a handful of promises she can't back up with a single dollar. Someone in the crowd laughed, then someone else. The woman's hand stopped moving. She stayed on her knees for just a moment, that terrible suspended moment when a person is deciding whether they are going to fall apart or hold themselves together, and Benjamin watched her chin come up. Slow, deliberate. The way a person lifts their chin when they are absolutely not going to give an audience the satisfaction of seeing them break. She picked up the last spool of thread, set it into what remained of the sewing box, and stood up. She was taller than he'd thought. She held the broken box against her chest with both arms, and she looked at Nathan Whitlock directly, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than Benjamin expected. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "I wrote to you honestly about my circumstances. My family's property was lost. I told you so in my 3rd letter." "Your 3rd letter arrived after I'd already paid for the arrangement," Whitlock said. "Which makes you, in my estimation, a woman who made a deliberate choice to deceive a man who was offering her a decent life." "I made no deception. I told you the truth. You told me a truth you held back until it was too late for me to walk away from the cost." He looked out at the crowd. "I don't take damaged goods. I don't take a woman who comes empty-handed with a story about lost family property. I worked too hard for too long to take on somebody else's ruin." The word landed like a stone, ruin. The crowd was quiet for just a beat, and then the murmuring started, and Benjamin heard it, not sympathy, not outrage, but the low, satisfied sound of people who had been given permission to agree with something cruel. The woman, her name, he would learn later, was Lillian Harper, and she had come from Cheyenne, Wyoming, before that from a town in Ohio that no longer existed as anything except a name on county records. Lillian Harper stood holding her mother's broken sewing box and her worn leather suitcase and her small black Bible, and she did not cry. She did not argue further. She looked at Whitlock for a long moment with something in her eyes that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was something harder and quieter than either, and then she looked down at the Bible at her feet. She bent to pick it up. That was when Benjamin Carter moved. He wasn't a man who made decisions slowly. He had never been that kind of man. His father had told him once the only piece of advice the old man had offered, that Benjamin had actually kept, that a man who thinks too long about doing the right thing has already spent too long not doing it. Benjamin had filed that away at 16 and had not forgotten it in the 20 years since. He crossed the platform in 10 steps. The crowd pulled back without quite knowing why. It was something in the way he moved, or the size of him, or simply the fact that Benjamin Carter, walking towards something with purpose, had always been the kind of sight that made sensible people get out of the way. He stopped beside Lillian Harper. He bent down. He picked up the Bible before she could reach it, and he held it out to her. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown, and they were dry, and they were watching him the way a person watches something they don't fully trust yet, but haven't decided to run from. He placed the Bible in her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. He did not answer. He turned to look at Nathan Whitlock. Whitlock's grin had shifted into something more cautious. He knew Benjamin Carter well enough to be careful. "Most men in the territory did," Carter Whitlock said by way of greeting. Whitlock. Benjamin looked at him for a moment with the particular flatness that men who have been in genuine danger in their lives develop as a natural expression, not aggression, not a threat, just the absence of anything false. "The arrangement's off?" "Arrangement's off. She arrived under false pretenses. That's a matter between her and the territorial court if she wants to push it, but as far as I'm concerned—" "As far as you're concerned," Benjamin said, "she's no longer your business." "That's right, good." Benjamin looked back at Lillian Harper. Then he reached up and removed his hat. The platform had been noisy with murmuring and shuffling, and the low social current of a crowd that thinks it knows how a story ends. It went quiet in the span of about 3 seconds. Quiet enough that Benjamin could hear the heat, the insect sound of it, the way wind moved through the platform boards, the distant stamp of horses at the hitching post down the street. He said, "I'll take her." 3 words. 3 words and 40 people on a train platform, held their breath at exactly the same moment. Nathan Whitlock's expression passed through several things: quickly surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like relief. Because if Benjamin Carter was taking responsibility for the woman, then Whitlock was clean of the situation. But behind the relief there was something else, something smaller and meaner, and Benjamin filed it away for later. "You don't even know her name," somebody in the crowd said. Benjamin did not look toward the voice. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He looked at Lillian. She was staring at him. Not with gratitude that came later. Maybe, but with the particular careful look of a woman who had already been surprised once today by a man's choices, and was not going to let herself be surprised a second time without understanding what she was agreeing to. "Miss," he said, "my name is Benjamin Carter. I run a cattle ranch about 12 miles north of here, up toward the mountains. It's a working ranch. Hard work. The house has been empty a long time." He paused. "I'm not offering you charity. I'm not offering you a marriage arrangement today. I'm offering you a roof and a wage and a chance to figure out where you stand. That's all. You can say no." Lillian Harper looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathan Whitlock, who had already shifted his attention away from her entirely, and was talking to a man beside him in the low, easy tone of someone who had already moved on. Then she looked back at Benjamin. "I can cook," she said. "I can sew and mend and keep accounts. I can manage a household, and I learn fast. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I didn't ask what you could do," Benjamin said. "I know you didn't," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite. But something. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on. "Harlan." He raised his voice without turning. A ranch hand detached from the edge of the crowd and came forward, young man, maybe 20. With a sun-browned face and the look of someone who had spent years working outdoors and was entirely comfortable in the presence of things he didn't fully understand. "Help the lady with her things." Harlan reached down and picked up the suitcase. He looked at Lillian uncertainly. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said. And there was something in her voice, the particular warmth of a person who has not been spoken to with simple courtesy in longer than they should have had to wait for it, that made the young ranch hand stand a little straighter. Benjamin turned toward his wagon without another word to the crowd. Behind him he heard the murmuring start up again, louder now. The particular charged sound of a crowd that has witnessed something it doesn't know what to do with. He heard Whitlock's voice among it, dismissive, already reframing the morning into a story where his decisions made sense. He heard a woman's voice saying something sharp about propriety, and another man's voice wondering aloud what Carter was thinking. He kept walking. He was thinking, if he was honest with himself, that he had not planned to leave the train station with anything except flour and wire and lamp oil. He was thinking that the supply list in his coat pocket had not included a woman with a broken sewing box and more spine than most of the men he'd ever hired. He was thinking that Whitlock's word ruin was still hanging in the air of that platform behind him, and that he had spent enough years in this territory to know exactly what happened to a woman who was left standing alone in a town that had already decided she was someone else's problem. He was thinking that he was 41 years old, and that his house had been quiet for a long time, and that he had made peace with the quiet, or had told himself he had, which was not the same thing. He was thinking none of these things, he told himself. He was thinking about the route home and the work that needed doing, and the fact that the autumn weather would be turning in 6 weeks, and there was fencing that needed attention on the east pasture. He heard Lillian Harper's boots on the platform boards behind him, a steady, even step, no hesitation, and he did not slow down, and she did not ask him to. The wagon was loaded by the time they reached it. Harlan had already secured the supply crates. He looked at Benjamin, then at the woman, then back at Benjamin, with the expression of a young man who has learned that asking questions of his employer about things that were not his business was not a strategy that led anywhere useful. Benjamin climbed up to the driver's bench. Lillian Harper set her broken sewing box carefully in the wagon bed and climbed up beside him without being invited and without waiting for help. She smoothed her skirt. She looked straight ahead. The wagon pulled away from the station, and neither of them said a word for the first quarter mile. It was Lillian who spoke first. "Mr. Carter." "Yes." "I want you to know," she said, "that I am not going to pretend I am not grateful. I am deeply grateful. What you did back there took something." "Took about 30 seconds," Benjamin said. "That's not what I mean." She paused. "People don't do that. Step into something that isn't their problem." Most people look away. I noticed a silence, the wagon wheels on the road. The sound of the horses, the heat and the dry smell of Montana in July. "I also want you to know," Lillian said, "that I am going to work. I am not a charity case, and I don't intend to become one. Whatever you need done on that ranch, you tell me, and I'll do it. And when I have enough saved to move on, I'll move on and we'll settle square. If that's agreeable." Benjamin looked at the road ahead. "That's agreeable," he said. Another silence. "What's the ranch called?" she asked. "Carter Ranch," he said. "I'm not a man who names things elaborately." "No," she said, and there was something dry and almost amused in her voice that surprised him. "I wouldn't have thought so." He glanced at her sideways. She was still looking straight ahead. The travel hat had been tilted slightly by the wind, and she reached up and straightened it without looking away from the road. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lillian," she said. "Benjamin Carter." "Yes," she said. "I heard." The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, the main house first, long and low, built from timber and stone with a wide porch that faced south. Behind it, the barn, the bunkhouse, the cook shack, the corrals. Beyond all of it, the mountains, blue-gray and immense, filling the northern sky the way they always did, reminding a person of exactly how small every human arrangement truly was. Harlan pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Two other ranch hands appeared from the direction of the barn, older men, both of them, who had worked the Carter Ranch for going on 6 years. They looked at Benjamin. They looked at the woman beside him. They looked at each other. They did not say anything. Benjamin climbed down from the wagon. "Lillian Harper," he said, by way of introduction to no one in particular. "She'll be managing the house. You'll treat her with the same respect you treat anyone else on this ranch, which means you'll treat her well, or you'll find work somewhere else. That's the only time I'll say it." The two hands looked at each other again. "Yes, sir," said the older one. His name was Pete Granger, and he had been foreman on the Carter Ranch since Benjamin bought the land, and he had, in that time, watched Benjamin Carter make approximately 400 decisions without asking for anyone's opinion, and had been wrong about maybe a dozen of them. He had learned to trust the pattern. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said to Lillian, "welcome to the Carter Ranch." Lillian looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Granger." "Pete Granger, Mr. Granger." She stepped down from the wagon. She picked up her suitcase herself before Harlan could reach it. "Could someone show me the kitchen?" Pete looked at Benjamin. Benjamin nodded once. "Right this way, ma'am," Pete said. Benjamin watched them cross the yard toward the house. He watched Lillian Harper walk that same steady, even step, the same straight back, the same deliberate attention to where she was putting her feet. She did not look back at him. He turned toward the barn. There was fencing that needed attention on the east pasture. That was what he was going to think about. The kitchen, when Lillian first walked into it, was the kind of room that tells you everything you need to know about a house and the life that has been lived in it. The iron stove was cold, the shelves were dusty, there was a pot hanging from a hook that had not been washed properly after its last use weeks ago, from the look of it. A tin cup sat on the table with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. Someone had left a rag on the floor near the wood box, and it had been there long enough to be stiff with grime. Lillian set her suitcase down. She set her broken sewing box down beside it. She put her Bible on the windowsill. She picked up the rag off the floor, looked at it, and dropped it in the trash bucket near the door. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started a fire in the stove. Pete Granger watched all of this from the doorway with something that would take him several days to properly identify as relief. "Is there flour?" she asked, without turning around. "Yes, ma'am." "Pantry?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Send someone to the root cellar if there is one. I'll need to know what's down there. And I'll need water." "How far is the well?" 20 feet off the back door." "Good," she said again. She was moving with a kind of quiet efficiency that Pete had not seen in the kitchen of this house in going on 4 years. "What time do the men eat supper?" 6 o'clock, ma'am." "Generally." She looked at the cold stove, at the pantry door, at the window above the sink, where the light was still strong and golden with afternoon sun. "They'll eat at 6, she said. "Go tell them." Pete went. In the barn, Benjamin Carter was replacing a piece of worn leather on a harness, and absolutely not thinking about anything except the harness, when Pete appeared in the doorway. "That woman," Pete said. Benjamin did not look up. "What about her?" "She's already got the stove going, and she's asking about the root cellar, and she wants to know everything we've got in the pantry." Benjamin kept working. "She's been here 20 minutes, Pete said. "I know how long she's been here." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Boss," he said finally, "where'd she come from?" "Ohio, originally." "Most recently Cheyenne." "I mean, how'd she end?" "Whitlock's mail order arrangement fell through," Benjamin said. He decided she wasn't what he expected. Pete was quiet again. "Whitlock's a fool," Pete said finally. "Yes," Benjamin said. "He is." Pete turned to go. "Pete." "Yes, sir." "She said she'd work for a wage and move on when she had enough saved." Benjamin set down the harness. "She may mean it. Or she may change her mind when she sees how much this place needs. Either way, you treat her like she's here for the long term. Because I don't know yet what the long term looks like, and I'd rather be wrong about that in the direction of decent." Pete nodded. "Yes, sir," he said. He left. The ranch hands ate at 6 o'clock that evening. Lillian had made biscuits from flour and lard and a scrape of salt, a beef stew from dried meat and root vegetables she'd found in the cellar, and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The men sat down and were quiet, in the way men get quiet when something exceeds what they were prepared for. Harlan looked at the biscuit in his hand and then at the woman across the kitchen and said, "Ma'am, this is the best biscuit I've had since I left Arkansas." Lillian poured coffee without turning around. "Then you've been eating badly," she said. "And you shouldn't have had to." Harlan looked at Pete. Pete looked at his stew. He ate 2 full bowls. Benjamin did not eat with the men. He came in after they'd finished, when the kitchen was mostly cleaned, and Lillian was at the table writing in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. He stopped in the doorway. She did not look up. "There's stew on the stove," she said. "Biscuits in the cloth on the shelf. Coffee still warm." He moved to the stove and filled a bowl. He sat at the far end of the table. She kept writing. He ate. The kitchen was warm from the stove and clean in a way it had not been clean in a very long time. He could smell something underneath the food soap, he realized. She had scrubbed the table. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Inventory," she said. "What's in the pantry? What's in the cellar? What you're low on and what you're out of. I'll give you a list tomorrow of what needs to be ordered." He looked at her. "You did all this in one afternoon," he said. "I worked fast." She looked up then, and her eyes were direct and calm and not apologetic. "I didn't touch anything that seemed like it might be personal to you. I left your desk in the front room as I found it. But the kitchen it needed attention." "It did," he said. She went back to writing. He ate his stew. Outside, the first stars were coming through in the Montana sky, enormous and close the way they always were out here, and the ranch was settling into the sounds of evening horses in the corral. The low voices of the hands in the bunkhouse, the dry creak of the house cooling in the dark. Benjamin Carter finished his meal. He sat for another moment without moving. Then he said, "The roof roof on the north side of the house leaks when it rains hard. I keep meaning to fix it. Lillian kept rooms, she asked. Second room on the right upstairs. I'll put a bucket. I'll get to the roof before the fall rains. All right, she finished a line. Mr. Carter, yes. She set down her pencil and looked at him. Why did you do it, she asked, back at the station. You didn't know me. You had no reason. He looked at her for a moment. Because nobody else was going to, he said. She held his gaze. That's it, she said. That's it, he said. She studied him the way she had studied him at the station carefully, without either trust or mistrust, just the particular honesty of someone trying to see a thing clearly. All right, she said. She picked up her pencil. He stood, took his bowl to the counter, rinsed it in the basin. He went to the doorway, Lillian. She looked up. There's a room at the top of the stairs, first door on the left. The one that doesn't leak, it's yours. He went to bed. Lillian Harper sat alone at the clean kitchen table in the warm light of the lamp and looked at the notebook in front of her, and at the pencil in her hand, and at the window above the sink where the dark sky was full of stars. She had been awake for 23 hours. She had traveled 2,000 miles. She had been publicly humiliated by a man who looked at her like she was an inconvenient mistake. She had been offered something she didn't quite have words for, yet by a man she didn't know at all. She was sitting in a kitchen she had scrubbed clean in an afternoon, in a house on a ranch in Montana, with a room at the top of the stairs that was hers, that had a window, that faced the mountains. She picked up her pencil. She finished the inventory. Then she closed the notebook, turned down the lamp, and walked upstairs to the room that was hers, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. And for the first time since the train had pulled into Red Hollow Station, and the whole world had watched her fall apart on a wooden platform, Lillian Harper allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safe, not yet, not happy, it was too soon, and she was too honest with herself for that. But something that might, if she was careful with it, if she didn't press on it too hard before it was ready, become one or the other. She lay down without undressing, pulled the blanket over herself, and slept. In the barn, Benjamin Carter blew out his lantern and listened to the silence of the ranch at night, the sounds that had surrounded him for years, and that he had stopped hearing so long ago he couldn't remember the last time they had registered as anything but absence, and he noticed, without quite knowing what to do with the noticing, that the silence was different tonight. Not smaller, just different. He didn't know why yet. He would figure it out. He turned over and slept. The next morning came hard and early, the way Montana mornings always did in the summer, not gentle, not gradual, but sudden and demanding, like someone pulling a curtain back without warning and expecting you to already be dressed. Lillian was up before the sun. She had slept 4 hours, maybe 5, and she woke with the particular clarity of a person who has too much to do to waste time lying in bed thinking about it. She found her way down the dark stairs by memory, lit the lamp in the kitchen, and had the stove going before the first gray light came through the window above the sink. She heard boots on the porch outside. The door opened and Pete Granger came in, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who had expected to be the first one awake and was recalibrating everything. "Ma'am," he said, "Mr. Granger." She was already measuring coffee grounds. "How many men eat breakfast?" "4, including me." "And Mr. Carter?" Pete paused. "He eats before the men generally." "He's been up since before I got out of the bunkhouse." She looked at the window, still dark outside. "When does he come in?" "He doesn't most mornings," Pete said. "He takes a cup of coffee from the cook shack and goes straight out." Lillian set the coffee pot on the stove. "The cook shack," she said. "Is that where the men have been eating?" "Since the last housekeeper left, yes, ma'am." 2 years back. She was quiet for a moment, measuring that 2 years of cold mornings and cook shack meals and a main house that nobody used the kitchen of except to leave dirty cups on the table. "All right," she said. "The men can eat here from now on if that's acceptable." Pete looked around the kitchen, clean stove, scrubbed table, the smell of coffee already starting to fill the room, and then back at her. "I reckon it's more than acceptable, ma'am," he said. She handed him the coffee pot. "Take that out to Mr. Carter before it's done brewing," she said. "Half-brewed coffee is better than no coffee. And tell him breakfast will be on the table in 30 minutes." Pete took the coffee pot with the expression of a man who had just been given an order by someone with no official authority to give it, and had decided, on reflection, that the order made complete sense. He went back out. Benjamin Carter was at the corral, working a young horse that had been giving trouble all week, a 3-year-old bay, with too much energy and not enough trust in the men who handled her. He heard Pete's boots in the dirt and turned. Pete held out the coffee pot. Benjamin stared at it. "From Miss Harper," Pete said. "She says breakfast is in 30 minutes. Benjamin took the coffee pot. He poured a cup into the tin mug he'd been holding and drank it without speaking. It was strong and hot, and better than anything the cook shack had produced in recent memory. He handed the pot back. "She's been up since before dawn," he said. "Looks that way." Benjamin looked toward the house. "Go tell Harlan that Bay needs work again after breakfast," he said. "She's almost there. Just needs another hour." "Yes, sir." Pete turned to go. "Pete, sir." Benjamin looked at his coffee. "She managed the stove all right. I should have shown her where the kindling was kept." Pete kept his face entirely still. "She found it, boss," he said. He went. Breakfast that morning was eggs, real eggs. From the hens that had been wandering the yard untended for 2 seasons, and were so surprised to be collected from that they barely resisted, fried hard in the iron pan with salt and a scrape of the smoked pork that had been hanging in the cellar. Since the previous fall, and that Lillian had apparently located, inspected, declared acceptable, and sliced down without anyone needing to direct her to any of it. There were biscuits again, different from last night's, lighter, and a jar of the last of some preserves she'd found in the back of the pantry shelf behind a sack of dried beans. The 4 ranch hands sat down and were, for the second time in less than 12 hours, entirely silent, in a way that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with the particular stunned gratitude of men who had not eaten properly in a long time and were only now remembering what properly felt like. Harlan looked at the eggs. He looked at Lillian. "Ma'am," he said. "Did you find those hens yourself?" "They weren't hiding," she said. "They were just waiting for someone to look." Pete laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, but it was real, and Lillian glanced at him, and there was something in her face, brief, controlled, but warm, that told Benjamin, sitting at the far end of the table, that she had noticed it mattered. He ate and said nothing, but he noticed it too. The days that followed moved in a pattern that nobody had designed and nobody announced. They simply emerged, the way patterns do when practical people occupy the same space and have too much work to spend energy on ceremony. Lillian organized the house from the inside out, not aggressively, not in a way that announced itself, but steadily, the way water finds the low places in a field and fills them without drama. She found things that had been misplaced and put them where they made sense. She repaired curtains that had been torn and left folded on a shelf. She found a cracked window pane in the upstairs hallway and plugged the gap with a strip of cloth until it could be properly fixed, and she wrote it on a list she kept in her notebook under the heading, "Things That Need Doing." The list grew and then shrank as she worked through it, and then grew again as she found more. The kitchen had become a different room entirely. Meals appeared 3 times a day, at times the men could depend on. The quality varied with what the pantry and cellar held, but it was always hot and always enough and always something that had been thought about, rather than thrown together. The ranch hands adapted to it, the way men adapt to comfort they weren't expecting, with a certain sheepishness, as though they felt they should apologize for how much they appreciated it. Only Benjamin said nothing. He came in, ate, and went back out. He was not cold, he was not rude. When she spoke to him, he answered. When she asked him something, he answered that too, directly and without elaboration. But he did not initiate conversation. He did not sit after meals. He did not ask how her day had gone or how she was settling in or whether she needed anything. Lillian noticed. She was not offended by it. She was, if anything, curious because the silence was not hostile. It was not the silence of a man who was indifferent to her. It was the silence of a man who had made a habit of keeping his own company for so long that he had forgotten there was another option. She had known men like that. Her father had been one. Not cold, not cruel, just withdrawn, like a door that had been pushed shut so many times it finally stayed that way. She did not push, but she did not stay invisible either. On the fourth day she found a kitchen garden plot behind the house, or rather she found what had been one. The soil was still good. The beds were overgrown, but the structure was there, posts and wire and the outlines of what had been, not long ago, a working garden. She went to the barn where Pete was mending tack. Mr. Granger, she said. Was there a kitchen garden here before? Pete looked up. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Albright. She was housekeeper before the last one. She kept one. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs along the back. What happened to it? Pete put down the leather in his hands. There was something careful in the way he answered. Mrs. Albright passed on, he said. 4 years back. Nobody took it up after. Lillian looked at the plot. Is there seed anywhere on the property? There might be some in the supply shed. Leftover from when we used to plant a kitchen patch closer to the bunkhouse. He paused. It's late in the season for a lot of things. It's not too late for everything, she said. Pete watched her walk toward the supply shed. He sat there for a moment. Then he called out, second shelf from the bottom. Left side, in the tin box. She raised one hand briefly without turning around. She found the tin box. She planted beans, late squash, and 2 rows of radishes along the back where the soil had the most sun. She worked the ground herself with a short-handled hoe she found hanging inside the supply shed, moving steadily and without hurry through the afternoon heat. She was still in the garden when the sun was going low enough to throw long shadows across the yard. Benjamin came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. She was on her knees in the dirt, pressing seeds into a shallow trench she'd drawn with her finger, and she did not notice him standing there for almost a full minute. When she looked up, she didn't startle. I found seed, she said. I hope that's all right. I'll replant this properly in the spring, but there's time for a fall crop if the weather holds. Benjamin looked at the garden plot, at the rows she'd already finished, neat and even. At the stakes she'd reset in the corners. He looked at her for a moment. Mrs. Albright put that in, he said. She kept it for 12 years. Lillian was quiet. Was she the housekeeper before? She asked. She was. He said it without elaboration, but there was something in the 2 words that told her there was more, and that he was not going to offer it. She did not ask. She pressed another seed into the soil. I'll have it in better shape by fall, she said, and by next spring you'll have enough to reduce what you're ordering in. He looked at the rows she'd planted. All right, he said. He went back into the barn. Lillian kept planting. It was Pete who told her eventually. Not because she asked, she never asked, but because Pete Granger was the kind of man who came to trust a person by degrees, and when he finally trusted them, he gave them the information they needed to understand the place they were living in. He found her on the porch one evening, mending one of the ranch hand's shirts the second week, a Thursday, warm and windless, and he sat down on the step without being invited and turned his hat in his hands and said, Mrs. Albright kept house here for 12 years. She came after Mr. Carter's wife passed. Lillian's needle stopped. She did not look up. His wife, she said. Clara Carter. She died in the winter of 1878. Their son with her, he was 2 years old. Pete turned his hat again. Fever took them both in about a week. Mr. Carter was out north with the herd when it happened. By the time he got back, Lillian set the shirt down in her lap. He doesn't talk about it, Pete said. He never has. But I've been on this ranch for 6 years and I've never once seen him sit on this porch in the evening, or eat a meal slow, or do anything that didn't have a purpose he could point to. He paused. Until yesterday morning. He stood at the kitchen window for about 2 minutes just watching you in the garden. Lillian looked at the shirt in her hands. He didn't know you were watching, she said. No, ma'am. She picked up her needle again. Thank you, Mr. Granger, she said, for telling me. Pete stood. I'm not saying it to make you feel sorry for him, he said. He wouldn't want that. I'm saying it because... He stopped again, searching for the right words with the particular difficulty of a man who is not accustomed to having them. Because I think you're good for this place, ma'am. And I think you deserve to understand what kind of place it is. He put his hat on and went back toward the bunkhouse. Lillian sat on the porch until the stars were out. She thought about a man who had built a life around a grief he couldn't name and a silence he'd filled with work for 6 years. And she thought about how a person could be perfectly functional and absolutely alone at the same time. And she recognized the specific shape of that loneliness because she had been carrying a version of it herself for longer than she liked to admit. She had come west to stop being invisible. She had stepped off that train expecting a future. Instead, she had gotten a floor and a man who ate his meals at the far end of the table without speaking. But she thought about the 2 minutes at the kitchen window. She thought about that for a long time. The following Tuesday, 3 things happened that changed the temperature of everything. The first was small. Benjamin came in from a fence repair job on the east pasture with a cut on his right hand, not serious, but deep enough to need attention, and he had wrapped it in a rag that was already soaked through by the time he came into the kitchen. Lillian was at the stove. She turned and saw the hand and said nothing dramatic. She said, "Sit down," and he sat, and she went for the small tin of clean cloth and the bottle of alcohol she had organized into the cabinet near the window. And she cleaned the cut and wrapped it properly, with the brisk competence of a woman who had dealt with injuries before and did not feel the need to perform concern. He watched her hands while she worked. She tied the final knot and said, "You'll need to keep that dry for 2 days, or it'll pull open again." "I've got fence work," he said. "I know you do," she said. "Keep it dry anyway." She started to stand, his unwrapped left hand moved and then stopped. A half gesture, arrested before it completed. The kind of movement a person makes when they start towards something and then remember they've decided not to want it. She saw it, she did not react to it. She stood and went back to the stove. But she had seen it. The second thing was the letter. It arrived on Wednesday, carried out from town by Harlan, who had gone in for feed, and he brought it to Lillian because it was addressed to the Carter Ranch housekeeper in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table while Harlan watched with unconcealed curiosity. It was from a woman in town, Margaret Elise Cole, who had a dress shop on the main street of Red Hollow, and who had, apparently, heard about Lillian's arrival in the particular way that information travels in small western towns, thoroughly and with embellishment. The letter was polite on the surface. Beneath the politeness, it was something else. Margaret Cole wrote that she wanted to introduce herself as a neighbor and that she hoped Lillian was finding the Carter Ranch to her liking. She wrote that she had known Benjamin Carter for many years and that she hoped any arrangements being made between them were of a proper and legally documented nature, for both parties' protection. She wrote that the women of Red Hollow were a close community and that she looked forward to having the opportunity to call. Harlan, who had been pretending not to read along from across the table, said, "What does it say?" "That I'm being watched," Lillian said. She folded the letter and put it in her notebook. Harlan opened his mouth. "Go see to the feed," Lillian said. He went. She sat for a moment with her hand flat on the notebook. She had known this was coming. Small towns did not absorb newcomers quietly, and she had arrived under circumstances that were, to say the least, visible. She had been the woman on the platform, the woman Whitlock threw back, the woman Benjamin Carter took home from the railroad station in front of 40 witnesses. She was being watched. That was all right. She had nothing to hide. But she understood, suddenly and with complete clarity, that the scrutiny was not going to be friendly, and that it was not going to stay in letters. She was right. The third thing happened that afternoon. Benjamin came in early, unusual enough, that looked up when she heard his boots on the porch, and he came into the kitchen and set his hat on the hook and said, without preamble, "Nathan Whitlock is telling people in town that you deceived him." She went still. "What kind of deception?" she asked. "He's saying you knew about the property loss before you started writing to him. That you deliberately withheld it until after he'd invested in the arrangement. I wrote to him about it in my third letter," she said. "Before he'd completed the arrangement. I know that." "How do you know that?" "Because I went to the territorial office this morning and asked about the mail order registry," he said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the table. "The correspondence is logged. Your third letter is in the record, dated 2 weeks before Whitlock finalized anything." She looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. "You did that this morning," she said. "Yes, before you told me what he was saying. I wanted to know the facts before I repeated the rumor," he said. "That's the order things should go in." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not with tears or with relief that made a show of itself, but the way a person looks when they realize, incrementally, that someone is treating them with a seriousness they were not sure they were going to receive. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Benjamin," he said. She paused. "Benjamin," she said. "What is he trying to do?" "I don't know yet." He sat down for the first time, at the near end of the table instead of the far end. "But Whitlock doesn't do things without a reason. He's not clever enough for strategy, but he's sharp enough for spite, and spite with a purpose is worth paying attention to." "He's angry," she said. "I came here and I'm not ruined, and that bothers him." "Yes," Benjamin said, "that's what I think." She was quiet for a moment. "What do I do?" she asked. He looked at her. "Nothing yet." "We watch we," she said. "Yes," he said, "we." He picked up the folded paper and put it back in his coat. "I'm going to need to go to town Thursday," he said. "Supply run. You could come if you want. Better that people see you standing upright than hiding out here." Lillian was quiet. "People will talk," she said. "They're already talking," he said. "Might as well give them something accurate to talk about." He stood and picked up his hat. "7 in the morning," he said. "If you want to come." He went out. Lillian stood at the kitchen table with her hand on her notebook and listened to his boots cross the porch, and she thought about the word "we" and what it cost a man like Benjamin Carter to say it. And she thought it was probably one of the most significant things that had happened to her since she stepped off that train. She was at the wagon at 6:50 Thursday morning. Benjamin was already there. He said nothing about her being early. She said nothing about him noticing. Red Hollow received them the way small towns receive things they haven't decided how to classify yet, with a particular quality of attention that pretended not to be attention. Lillian felt the eyes from the moment the wagon rolled down the main street. Felt them from the general store, from the barber's doorway, from the upper window of the boarding house that she understood, now, was Whitlock's establishment. She sat straight and looked forward and did not hurry. Benjamin drove the wagon to the mercantile and climbed down without ceremony and said, "I'll be at the feed store." "Take the list in," and handed her the supply list, and walked away, which she understood without needing. It explained was intentional. He was giving her the chance to walk into that mercantile alone, to be seen as a person conducting business and not as someone being escorted by a protector. She took the list and went in. The mercantile was run by a man named Carl Briggs, who had a thin mustache and the cautious hospitality of a merchant who did not want to take sides in anything but had strong opinions about most things. He looked at her over the counter with the particular expression of a man who has heard several versions of a story and is trying to figure out which one she belongs to. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Briggs." She set the list on the counter. "Carter Ranch supply order." Mr. Carter said you'd have most of it in stock, and the rest could be put on account. Briggs looked at the list. He looked at her. "You've been managing the house out there," he said. "Yes. How long you figure you'll be staying?" She met his eyes steadily. "As long as the work is there," she said, "and the work doesn't appear to be going anywhere." Briggs held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have this pulled together in an hour," and turned to the shelves. She was at the counter, waiting when the door behind her opened. She knew before she turned. Something in the particular hush that came through the doorway with the person, the way sound changes when someone enters a room with intention. Nathan Whitlock. He was dressed well again. He was always dressed well. She was coming to understand. Because the clothes were a statement about how he wanted to be seen, and he stood in the doorway for just a moment before he moved to the counter and set his own list beside hers, as though she wasn't there. "Briggs," he said. "My usual Mr. Whitlock," Briggs said with the particularly neutral intonation of a man being very careful. Whitlock turned. He looked at Lillian the way a man looks at a mistake he's decided was someone else's fault. "Miss Harper," he said, "I heard you were settling in at Carter's place." "You heard correctly," she said. "I hope you've been honest with him about your situation," he said. "More honest than you were with me." The mercantile was quiet. Briggs had stopped moving. "I was honest with you, Mr. Whitlock," Lillian said. "I wrote you about my family's property in my third letter, and I have the territorial registry record to prove it." Something flickered in Whitlock's expression. Fast gone almost immediately, but she caught it. He hadn't known about the registry record. He had assumed the correspondence was private between them. "Records," he said. "Interesting thing for a woman in your position to be running to." "Records are for everyone," she said. "That's what makes them useful." He looked at her for a moment. Something had shifted in him, not retreat exactly, but recalculation. The story he'd been telling about her had a fact in it he hadn't accounted for. "You might want to think carefully," he said, and his voice was quieter now, which made it more dangerous, "about the kind of situation you're putting yourself in. Carter's a hard man. He's been alone a long time. Whatever he told you he was offering." "He offered me work and a roof," she said. "He's delivered both." "I'm not sure what concern that is of yours." Whitlock looked at her. He looked at Briggs. He looked back at her. "I'm just speaking as a neighbor," he said. "Then speak less," she said, "and I'll do the same." "Good day, Mr. Whitlock." She turned back to the counter. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her heart was hammering. Whitlock stood behind her for a moment. She felt it the way you feel weather, the particular pressure of someone deciding what to do, and then she heard his boots on the floor, and the door opened and closed. Briggs let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said. "Is my order ready?" she asked. "Give me 45 minutes," he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Something that had not been there before. She nodded and went to sit on the bench outside the mercantile. Benjamin found her there 20 minutes later. He came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her face, not upset, not shaken, but carrying the particular quiet tension of someone who has come through something and is processing what it means. He sat beside her on the bench without asking what had happened. "Whitlock was in the mercantile," she said. "I know," he said. "Briggs sent his boy over. He warned me about you," she said. "Said I should think carefully about the situation I'd put myself in." Benjamin was quiet. "What did you say?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "I told him to speak less." The silence stretched for exactly one beat. Then Benjamin Carter said good, and the single word held more respect in it than most speeches Lillian Harper had ever heard, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the wagon loaded, the sun going long and gold across the Montana grass. Halfway home, Benjamin said, without looking at her, "You did well in there." She did not make light of it. "Thank you," she said. "He's going to push harder," he said. "Whatever he's working up to, he's not done." "I know," she said. "Are you afraid of him?" She thought about it genuinely, without performing courage. Not of him, she said. Of what he could do if enough people listened to him. She paused. I've been invisible my whole life, Benjamin. I'm not afraid of most things anymore. But I am afraid of being made invisible again after I've finally started being seen. He was quiet for a long moment. He won't make you invisible, he said. Not while you're on Carter Ranch. She did not answer. But she did not look away. The ranch came into view at dusk, the mountains behind it going purple in the fading light, the lamp already lit in the kitchen window, because Harlan had lit it when he came in from the east pasture, following the new habit of a household that had, in less than 2 weeks, quietly reorganized itself around the idea that someone would be coming home. Lillian climbed down from the wagon before Benjamin could help her. She reached for the first crate. Leave it, he said. Harlan and Pete will unload. I don't mind. Leave it, he said again, and his voice was not sharp, only direct. You've done enough today. She looked at him. He was looking at her with something in his face she couldn't quite name, not the flat, careful look she'd gotten used to, but something underneath it. Something that had been there, she thought, for longer than today, but that was only now coming close enough to the surface to see. She stepped back from the crate. All right, she said. She went inside. She put water on for coffee and she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard where Benjamin was talking with Pete, gesturing toward the east pasture. All business, all purpose. The same man who never sat still, never stopped moving, never let himself rest. But he had told her she'd done enough today. He had noticed. She poured the coffee. She set a cup at the near end of the table, his end, the new end, and sat down at her own place and opened her notebook and began writing. And when the door opened 20 minutes later and Benjamin came in and saw the cup and picked it up without comment and sat down in the chair that had somehow, over the course of 2 weeks, become his, Lillian kept writing and did not make a ceremony of it. But she was smiling, just barely. Just enough, she kept writing. Outside, the Montana dark settled over the Carter Ranch, and in the bunkhouse the men were talking and laughing in the low, comfortable way of men who have eaten well and worked hard and have nowhere to be until morning. And somewhere in the east pasture a coyote called once and went silent, and the whole ranch breathed in and breathed out in the dark with the particular ease of a place where things are, for this moment, exactly as they should be. Whitlock's letter arrived the next morning, not to Lillian. To Benjamin. It was not a letter, exactly. It was a legal notice written in the formal language of a man who had paid someone to make his spite sound official. And it claimed that Lillian Harper owed Nathan Whitlock the cost of the original mail order arrangement plus damages for misrepresentation, and that if the sum was not received within 30 days, he would be pursuing the matter in territorial court. Benjamin read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He folded it and set it down. He looked at Lillian. She had read it over his shoulder. She had not been able to help herself, and she was standing with both hands on the back of a chair, and her face was very still and very controlled. He can't win that, Benjamin said. He knows that, she said. Then what does he want? She looked at him. He wants me to be afraid, she said. He wants me to take whatever money I've saved and leave before this gets ugly. He wants me gone, Benjamin, because as long as I'm here, everyone in Red Hollow can see that what he did on that platform was wrong. And Nathan Whitlock cannot stand being wrong where people can see it. Benjamin looked at the letter. Then we answer it, he said. With what? With a lawyer, he said, and the registry record. And whatever else we need. He stood up. He picked the wrong woman to make an example of. He picked up his hat. I'll be in town today, he said. Don't let it worry you. She looked at him, this man who had sat at the far end of her table for 2 weeks and said nothing, who had driven 12 miles to a territorial office to look at correspondence records before she even knew there was a problem, who had sat beside her on a bench outside a mercantile and said good like it meant everything. Benjamin. He stopped at the door. Why are you doing this? She asked. The real reason. Not the same answer you gave me at the station. He stood at the door for a moment. He turned around. And for the first time since she had arrived on this ranch, Benjamin Carter looked at her, not at the work she was doing, not at the practical arrangement they had made, not at the woman who was useful and competent and no trouble, but at her. Directly. The way you look at a person when you finally decided to stop pretending you're not looking. Because, he said, and his voice was lower than usual, rough at the edges, 6 years ago I stopped believing anything I built was worth building for. And then you showed up and scrubbed my kitchen table and planted seeds in November and walked into a mercantile like you owned the territory. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks I've started thinking maybe I was wrong about that. He put on his hat. I'll be back before supper, he said. He went out. Lillian stood in the kitchen alone, and the morning light was coming through the window, and somewhere outside she could hear Harlan talking to the horses in the corral, and the stove was ticking with heat. And she pressed both hands flat on the scrubbed surface of the kitchen table and stood there breathing for a long, full moment. Then she straightened up. She picked up her pencil. She had work to do. Benjamin came back from town that evening with 2 things Lillian had not expected. The first was a name James Aldred, a territorial attorney who had an office above the land registry on Red Hollow's Main Street and who had, according to Benjamin, listened to the full account of Whitlock's legal notice, with the particular focused quiet of a man assembling a picture in his mind before he speaks. The second thing Benjamin brought back was harder to read. He came in and sat at his end of the table and set his hat down and looked at it instead of at her, and Lillian recognized that posture, the set of his shoulders. The deliberate stillness as the posture of a man carrying information he hasn't yet decided how to deliver. She poured coffee and set it in front of him. She sat down. Tell me, she said. He looked up. Aldred says the legal notice is weak, he said. The registry record kills the misrepresentation claim before it can walk. Whitlock knew about the property loss in time to withdraw. He didn't withdraw, which means legally he accepted the amended terms. Then we're safe, she said. Legally, yes. He picked up the coffee. He set it down without drinking it. But Aldred said something else. He said Whitlock's been in his office twice in the past month. Not about you. Lillian was very still. Whose land? She asked. The parcel north of my east pasture, Benjamin said. 60 acres of river-fed grassland that I've been planning to purchase from the Hendricks family for 2 years. We had a verbal agreement, nothing filed yet. He paused. Whitlock's been negotiating with Aldred about the same parcel. Aldred couldn't say more than that, attorney discretion, but he told me to move fast. She looked at him. He's not after me, she said slowly. He never was. He's after your land, I think so. And I'm what? A distraction? A way to keep your attention on me while he moves on the Hendricks parcel? Or a way to damage my reputation enough that the Hendricks family starts to think twice about dealing with me, he said. A man who brings a dishonest woman home from a train station doesn't look like a man you want handling a land agreement on a handshake. The words settled between them like stones into water. Lillian thought about Whitlock in the mercantile, the way he had recalculated when she mentioned the registry record. He hadn't been angry about losing her. He had been calculating how much she knew. He's been planning this, she said. Yes, before I even arrived. The timing works, Benjamin said. He arranged for the mail-order bride knowing he'd reject her. Knowing it would make a scene. Knowing he stopped. Knowing you'd do what you did, she said quietly. He looked at her. I would have done it for anyone, he said. I know, she said. But he knew you too. He knew you wouldn't walk past. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they were both understanding at the same time, that the morning at the train station, the crowd, the platform, the broken sewing box, the 40 people who watched and did nothing, all of it had been calculated to produce exactly this. Benjamin Carter distracted, his reputation muddied, His attention divided while Nathan Whitlock moved on 60 acres of river-fed grassland that could make a man in the cattle business either very powerful or very easily outmaneuvered. Lillian stood up. "How long before Whitlock can file on the Hendricks parcel?" she asked. "Aldred thinks within the week." "Then you need to see the Hendricks family tomorrow," she said. "I was planning to ride out in the morning. I'm coming with you." He looked at her. "Eliza Hendricks is 72 years old," Lillian said before he could object. "She's been on that land for 40 years. She's going to decide who she sells to based on who she trusts, not who has the better legal argument. You said yourself the verbal agreement was with her husband, who passed." She met his eyes. "Let me come." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. 7 o'clock, he said. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. She lay in the dark in the room that was hers, and she thought about Whitlock and the land and the registry record and the legal notice. And she thought about Benjamin at the far end of the table, and Benjamin at the near end of the table, and the way those two distances measured something she didn't have clean words for yet. And she thought about the fact that she had arrived in Montana with nothing except a broken sewing box and a Bible and more determination than was probably sensible. And that she was now lying awake at midnight, thinking about land negotiations and territorial law and the long game of a man whose spite had turned out to be a strategy. She had not expected any of this. She was not, she realized with something approaching surprise, afraid of any of it. Eliza Hendricks lived on her parcel like she had grown out of it, a small, sharp-eyed woman with white hair and hands that had worked land for half a century and showed every year of it. She opened her door before they knocked, which meant she had heard the wagon coming half a mile out. And she looked at Benjamin, and then at Lillian, and then back at Benjamin, with the particular assessment of a woman who has seen enough of the world to read most situations before they announce themselves. "Ben Carter," she said, "I heard you'd gotten yourself some help." "Mrs. Hendricks," he said, "this is Lillian Harper. She's been running my household." Eliza looked at Lillian. "Lillian," Eliza said, "coffee's on." The negotiation, such as it was, happened over 2 hours at Eliza Hendricks's kitchen table, and it was not at all what Lillian had expected, and entirely what she should have anticipated. Because Eliza Hendricks had not survived 40 years on a Montana land parcel by being managed. She knew about Whitlock's offer. She had known for 3 weeks. "He came out himself," Eliza said, "dressed well, polite enough. He offered me $15 an acre over what Ben had promised." She looked at Benjamin. "You want to tell me why I shouldn't take it?" Benjamin looked at her steadily. "Because Whitlock doesn't want the land," he said. "He wants what the land does to my operation without it. My east herd has been running that river grass every summer for 4 years. Without it, I lose a third of my grazing capacity, and I have to sell cattle I'd otherwise keep. Whitlock knows that. He's not buying land, he's buying leverage." Eliza turned her cup in her hands. "And why should I care what he does with it once I've sold?" she said. $15 an acre is $15 an acre. This was the moment. Lillian felt at the particular hinge of it, the place where the conversation could go 2 ways, and only one of them was survivable. She looked at Benjamin, and he looked at her, just briefly, and she thought he was going to speak. She spoke instead. "Mrs. Hendricks," she said, "can I ask you something?" Eliza looked at her. "Your husband built this parcel," Lillian said. 40 years. He knew what that rivergrass land was worth, and he knew what it was worth to whom. He didn't agree to sell it to Benjamin Carter by accident. He knew what Benjamin would do with it. Eliza's expression did not change. But her hands went still on the cup. "Your husband is gone," Lillian said. "And now 2 men are sitting in front of you asking for what he built, and one of them wants it to grow something, and one of them wants it to damage something." She paused. "I think you already know which is which. I think you knew before we got here. I think the reason you haven't signed Whitlock's papers yet is the same reason you answered the door before we knocked." The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza Hendricks looked at Lillian Harper for a long time. Then she looked at Benjamin. Your verbal agreement was $40 an acre, she said. Cash 30 days. Yes, ma'am, Benjamin said. I want it in writing today, she said. I want Aldred's office to file it by end of week. Done, Benjamin said. Eliza stood. The coffee's gone cold, she said. Let me make another pot. On the ride back, Benjamin drove and Lillian sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for almost 10 minutes. The horses moved at an easy pace. The morning was already warming into full summer heat, and the grass on either side of the road was high and golden. How did you know what to say to her? Benjamin asked finally. I didn't, Lillian said. I knew what was true. I just said it. He looked at her sidelong. You're not what I expected, he said. She looked straight ahead. What did you expect? She asked. He was quiet. Someone who needed more looking after, he said. Most people say they want someone who needs looking after, she said. What they mean is they want someone who makes them feel needed. Is that what I meant? I don't know what you meant, she said. I know what you did. You stepped forward. That's different from needing someone to be helpless. He looked at the road. Yes, he said, it is. They filed the agreement with Aldred's office by Thursday. Whitlock found out by Friday. Lillian knew because Pete came in from town Friday afternoon with the feed order and a face that was trying very hard not to carry news and failing completely. What? She said. Pete set the feed receipts on the table. Whitlock was at the land office when Aldred filed the Hendricks agreement, Pete said. He was there on his own business. Apparently, an Aldred's clerk young kid talks too much let slip that the filing had gone through. And she said. And Whitlock left the land office and went directly to the sheriff, Pete said. He filed a complaint. Says you misrepresented yourself to an elderly widow to influence a land sale. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Then Lillian said, he filed against me. Yes, ma'am, not against Benjamin. No, ma'am, against you. She understood it immediately. If the complaint was against Benjamin, it was a business dispute, two men, land, money, territory. The sheriff would look at the paperwork and see an argument. But a complaint against a woman of uncertain standing, a woman with no legal history in the territory, a woman who had already been publicly accused of misrepresentation, once that was something a sheriff might actually move on. It was clever. She hated that it was clever. Where is Benjamin? She said. East pasture, Pete said. You want no, she said. I'll go. She found him at the far end of the east pasture, where the fence line met the river boundary of the newly purchased Hendricks land, and he was looking at it, not working, just looking. The way a man looks at something he has finally secured after a long time of needing it. He heard her coming and turned. He saw her face. What happened? He said. It was not a question, she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He did not talk over information. He absorbed it first and then responded, which made his responses always worth waiting for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's forcing a public airing, he said. If the sheriff takes the complaint, there'll be a hearing. The whole county sees it. He doesn't care if he wins. He wants the process, I know, she said. We can fight the complaint. Aldred can Benjamin. She stopped him. He looked at her. I want to address it publicly. He stared at her. A town meeting, she said, before the sheriff's hearing. Let me speak. Let the county hear the full account from me directly, not through a legal complaint filed by a man with a property grievance dressed up as a moral objection. I know what I'm asking, she said. I know how it looks. A woman with no standing in this county standing up in front of everyone who watched me on my knees on that platform. Her voice was steady. Absolutely steady. But the alternative is letting Whitlock control the story until it becomes the truth. And I won't do that. I've spent too long being invisible. I will not become invisible again to keep the peace. He looked at her. The wind was moving the tall grass at the river boundary. Somewhere across the pasture, cattle moved. There's risk, he said. There's always risk, she said. The question is whether it's worth taking. He studied her face. All right, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it at the wagon on the day she'd asked to come to the Hendricks farm. Straight and without condition. All right, he said again. We'll call the meeting. The town meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the Grain Hall on Red Hollow's South Street, which was the largest indoor space in the county, and which was, by 7 o'clock that evening, full. Not comfortably full, not politely full, packed, in the way a room gets packed when everyone has heard enough different versions of something that they need to see the original for themselves. Lillian had dressed carefully. Not expensively, she didn't have expensive, but carefully. Her best dress clean and pressed, her hair pinned properly. She had spent 20 minutes that morning staring at the small piece of mirror in her room and telling herself, without quite believing it, that she was ready. Benjamin had driven her in. Pete and Harlan came too, which she had not asked for and did not comment on, and which meant more to her than she had the right words to express. The crowd parted when they walked in, not dramatically. Not like a performance, but it parted the way crowds part for people who walk like they know where they're going. Nathan Whitlock was already there. He was at the front of the room with two men. Lillian didn't recognize one of them. She would learn later was his brother-in-law from the county seat. And the other was a man who sometimes did legal work for him without being qualified to practice law, which was a detail that would matter later. The sheriff, a man named Aldous Pratt, was standing near the window, with the expression of a man who had agreed to oversee something and was already regretting it. Lillian walked to the front of the room. She did not look at Whitlock. She turned to face the crowd. 400 people, give or take. Ranchers and merchants and their wives, ranch hands. The woman from the dress shop, Margaret Elise Cole, in the third row, with her hands folded in her lap. Carl Briggs from the mercantile, who gave Lillian a brief nod when their eyes met. Eliza Hendricks, small and upright at the end of a bench near the back, who had come 30 miles by buggy and looked like she had made that decision without any difficulty at all. Lillian took one breath. She began. 3 weeks ago, she said, and her voice carried cleanly through the hall, without her having to raise it, I stepped off a train at this county's railroad station and was told, in front of every person standing on that platform, that I was unwanted, that I was dishonest, that I had come to Montana with nothing, and that nothing was what I deserved. The hall was perfectly silent. I want to tell you about that claim, she said, because it has been repeated in this county for 3 weeks, in different forms, by the same man who made it on the platform. And I think it deserves a direct answer. She laid out the facts. Calmly, without drama, without the trembling performance of a woman asking for sympathy. She talked about the correspondence, the third letter, the dates. She talked about the territorial registry record. She talked about Nathan Whitlock's legal notice, and about the complaint he had filed with the sheriff, and about the timing of that complaint relative to the filing of the Hendricks land agreement. She said plainly, "This is not a story about whether I deceived Mr. Whitlock. The record proves I did not. This is a story about what a man does when he cannot use the legal system to win, so he uses it to damage. And I am standing here tonight to tell you that I will not be damaged quietly." A murmur moved through the crowd. Whitlock was on his feet. "She's got no standing in this county," he said, loudly enough to carry. "She's a hired housekeeper with no property, no history here, no." Mr. Whitlock. The voice was not Lillian's. It was Eliza Hendricks from the back of the room and 72 years of Montana in it. "Sit down." The murmur became something else. Not quite laughter, something between laughter and recognition, the sound of a room that has just seen something it knows is real. Whitlock did not sit down. "She influenced an elderly widow into a land sale that cost me." "It cost you nothing you were owed," Lillian said, and her voice cut clean across his. "You were not owed that land. You wanted it to use against a man who caught you out in a piece of public cruelty and refused to look away from it. That's what you're angry about, Mr. Whitlock. Not the land. Not the money. You're angry because someone saw what you did on that platform and did not pretend it was acceptable. The silence after that was the particular silence of a room that is deciding something. Whitlock looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Whitlock. And then Benjamin Carter, who had been standing at the side of the room the entire time without speaking, took 3 steps forward. He did not look at Whitlock. He looked at Lillian. And he said not loudly, but clearly, in the particular voice of a man who is telling one person something and has accepted that everyone else is going to hear it. He said, "I didn't take her because she needed saving. I chose her because she reminded me how to live." The grain hall was so quiet you could hear the lamp oil burning. Whitlock said, "That's a fine speech, Carter. Doesn't change the legal." "The legal complaint is withdrawn," said a voice near the front. Everyone turned. It was Sheriff Aldous Pratt. He had his arms crossed, and he was looking at Whitlock, the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in debating it. "Mr. Whitlock," Pratt said, "I agreed to oversee this meeting because I was told there was a genuine grievance to be heard. I've heard it. I've also heard the other side, which includes documentary evidence I've now reviewed twice." He paused. "The complaint against Miss Harper is withdrawn as of tonight on the grounds of insufficient evidence, and I'm being plain here, apparent bad faith. If you want to contest that, you can file in territorial court and wait 6 months for a judge who's going to submit registry record I just read and reach the same conclusion." Whitlock's face was doing several things at once. "You can't withdraw a citizen complaint," he said. "I just did," Pratt said. "Sit down, Nathan." Whitlock looked around the room. He looked at his brother-in-law, who was studying the floor. He looked at the man who did not quite legal work for him, who was already easing toward the door. He looked at Lillian. She looked back at him with the same expression she had worn on the platform the day she stood up from her knees. Not anger, not triumph, something harder and quieter than either. He sat down. The room exhaled, and then something happened that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted. Carl Briggs stood up from his bench in the middle of the room. "For what it's worth," he said, to nobody in particular and everybody in general, "Miss Harper has been running accounts at the Mercantile for 3 weeks, and every order's been correct, and every payment's been prompt. That's more than I can say for some." He looked at Whitlock briefly and then sat back down. From the 3rd row, Margaret Elise Cole stood up. Lillian braced herself. "I wrote you a letter," Margaret said, 3 weeks ago. "It was not a kind letter," she paused. "I was wrong to send it. And I'd like to say so in front of everyone, since most of them have probably heard about it anyway." She sat down. Pete Granger, standing at the back of the room, put his hat on his chest. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "from everyone at the Carter Ranch." Lillian stood at the front of that grain hall, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she did not cry, but it took everything she had, because she had been invisible for so long, so quietly, persistently. Deliberately invisible, that being seen this fully by this many people all at once was almost more than her chest could hold. She stood straight. She said, "Thank you." 2 words. They were enough. Benjamin was beside her in a moment, not dramatically, not in a gesture for the crowd, just suddenly there, the way he was always suddenly there when something needed attending to, and he said, very quietly, for her alone, "Are you all right?" She turned and looked at him. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before. The careful flatness was gone. He looked younger, she thought. He looked like a man who had put something heavy down and was still feeling the surprise of his own lightness. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and then so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "You were extraordinary." She looked at him for a long moment. "Don't tell me that when I'm trying not to cry," she said. And Benjamin Carter, the man who never smiled, smiled. Not widely, not for the room, just there, just real. "Let's go home," he said. She had one more thing to do first. She crossed the hall to the bench where Whitlock was sitting alone. Now his brother-in-law had gone. The legal adjacent man had gone. And Whitlock sat with his hat in his hands and the particular shrunken look of a man who has been publicly reduced and hasn't yet figured out how to reassemble himself. She stopped in front of him. He looked up. "I'm not your enemy, mister." "Whitlock," she said, "I was never your enemy. I was a woman who told you the truth and you chose not to hear it. That's a hard thing to carry, I know." She paused. "But you made it harder than it needed to be. For both of us." He said nothing. She did not wait for him to. She turned and walked back across the grain hall to where Benjamin was standing with Pete and Harlan, and she did not look back. The wagon ride home was the longest and the most comfortable silence Lillian had ever sat inside. The Montana sky was enormous and dark and full of stars, and the horses moved at an easy rhythm, and Benjamin drove with his elbows on his knees and his hat pushed back. And somewhere about halfway home he shifted his weight slightly so that his arm was against hers, just barely, just the warmth of it, not a gesture that announced itself. She did not move away, he did not speak, neither did she. But she was thinking clearly. Without the fog of fear that had been living in her chest for 3 weeks about what had happened in that hall, and what had been said and what had not been said, and what it meant that Benjamin Carter had stepped 3 paces forward and looked at her and not at the crowd when he said what he said. She was thinking about that word. Home, he had said, "Let's go home." Not "let's go back to the ranch," home. She was still thinking about it when the wagon turned in through the gate and the ranch came up around them in the dark familiar already. The barn and the bunkhouse and the corrals and the house, with the lamp burning in the kitchen window. She climbed down before he could help her. She stood for a moment in the yard looking up at the house. Then she said, without turning around, "Benjamin. Yes, thank you. For tonight. For all of it. For everything since the station." A pause. "You earned every bit of it yourself," he said. She turned around. He was standing by the wagon looking at her with that open face, the face without the careful distance in it, and the lamp from the kitchen window was putting gold light on the side of his jaw and the brim of his hat. "I know I did," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway." He held her gaze. "You're welcome," he said, "Lillian." She went inside. She stood in the kitchen, alone, and pressed both palms flat on the table, and breathed in the smell of the house wood smoke and coffee and soap and bread. All the smells she had made in 3 weeks out of a cold and empty kitchen, and she thought about what Pete had told her on the porch. About Clara, about the winter of 1878, about a man who had stopped believing anything he built was worth building for. She thought about what Benjamin had said at the east pasture fence. "Somewhere in the last 2 weeks I've started thinking, maybe I was wrong about that." She stood at the table for a long moment. Then she did what she always did when the world had given her too much to hold all at once. She opened her notebook. She wrote. What she wrote was not the inventory, not the accounts, not the list of things that needed doing on the ranch. She wrote 3 words, and then she stopped, and she looked at them, and she closed the notebook. Outside she heard Benjamin's boots on the porch steps. Heard him stop. Heard the particular small sound of a man who has reached his own door and paused before opening it, which was not his habit, which meant something was different tonight about the reaching and the pausing and the door. Then she heard him go in. She sat at the kitchen table. She was not afraid. She was not invisible. She was exactly where she had come 2,000 miles to be, not the place, not the ranch, not even the room at the top of the stairs, but this known, and standing, and not alone. And somewhere in the east pasture, 60 acres of river-fed grassland that had been legally secured by a man who had started believing again, and a woman who had never stopped, lay quiet in the Montana dark, waiting for morning. Whitlock's next move came at dawn. Lillian knew it the moment she heard the horse in the yard, fast, urgent, not the easy rhythm of the ranch hands coming in from the bunkhouse. She was at the stove and she looked out the window and saw a rider she didn't recognize pull up hard and call out for Carter. Benjamin came off the porch in 30 seconds. The rider was out of breath. "Mr. Carter," he said, "Bill Nessing sent me. He's got a problem." Whitlock was at his place last night late, after the meeting, and he convinced Bill to sign a document. Bill doesn't read well, and he thought it was a loan agreement. It wasn't. Benjamin went very still. What was it, he said. A proxy authorization, the writer said. Gives Whitlock the right to act on Bill Nessing's behalf in any land or business matter for the next 12 months. The silence was immediate and complete. Lillian stepped out onto the porch. Bill Nessing's land adjoined the Hendricks parcel on the south side. With a proxy over Nessing's business decisions, Whitlock didn't need the Hendricks land directly. He could encircle it. He could file water rights challenges, grazing disputes, access objections, a dozen different legal mechanisms that would make the Hendricks land nearly unusable without an adjoining southern access. He had lost the direct play. He had found an indirect one. When was it signed? Benjamin said. Last night, the writer said. After 10 o'clock, before or after the meeting ended. The writer looked uncomfortable after. Which meant Whitlock had left the grain hall, had sat there and heard the sheriff withdraw the complaint and watched the room turn against him, and had gone directly to Bill Nessing's house in the dark and talked a man who couldn't read properly into signing something he didn't understand. Lillian watched Benjamin's face. She had seen him steady. She had seen him certain. She had seen him angry in the quiet, controlled way of men who have learned to keep their anger useful rather than expensive. She had not seen this before. This was different. He turned and looked at her. Get Aldred, he said now. Can you take the wagon alone? Yes, she said. Go, he said. Tell him about the proxy. Tell him about Bill Nessing, and tell him it was signed after 10 o'clock last night. He'll know what that means. She was already moving toward the barn. Lillian, he called after her. She turned. Be careful, he said. Not be fast, not don't stop, not watch yourself. Be careful. The particular be careful of a man who has started to understand that something matters to him. Always, she said. She went. Lillian drove that wagon harder than she'd driven anything in her life. Not recklessly, she was not a reckless woman, but with the particular focused urgency of someone who understands exactly what is at stake and has calculated that speed and precision are not opposites when the situation demands both. The road into Red Hollow was 7 miles of packed dirt, and she knew every rut of it by now, and she took the curves wide and the straightaways fast, and she did not stop thinking the entire way. Whitlock had been clever. She had to give him that even now, even furious. The public meeting had stripped him of the direct attack. The sheriff's withdrawal had closed the legal complaint. The Hendricks filing had cost him the land he wanted. Any reasonable man would have cut his losses and recalibrated. But Whitlock was not a reasonable man. He was a spiteful one, which was worse, because spite had a kind of creative energy that reason didn't. Spite kept looking for the angle. Spite worked after dark when the rest of the town was asleep. Bill Nessing couldn't read well. Whitlock had known that. She pulled up in front of Aldred's office at 7:40 in the morning, tied the horses to the post, and took the stairs 2 at a time. James Aldred was at his desk with his coat already on and a cup of coffee in his hand, which told her he was a man who started early, and she was grateful for it. She gave him the full account in under 4 minutes, standing in the middle of his office without sitting down, because sitting down felt like slowing down, and she couldn't afford either. Aldred listened. When she finished, he set down his coffee. After 10 o'clock, he said yes. The meeting ended at what time? 9:30 approximately. Aldred was already moving to his filing cabinet. There's a territorial statute, he said, pulling a folder, regarding documents signed under conditions of limited comprehension. If Nessing can demonstrate he didn't understand what he was signing, and if there's evidence that Whitlock was aware of that limitation and used it deliberately, the proxy is voidable. He looked at her over the folder. When Whitlock wrote his legal notice to you, he used specific language about deliberate misrepresentation. I have that document on file, Lillian understood, which establishes that he knows what deliberate misrepresentation looks like, she said. Because he's accused someone else of it. Aldred almost smiled. "Miss Harper," he said, "I need you to go back to the ranch and bring me Benjamin Carter and Bill Nessing's signed testimony by noon." "Can you do that?" "I can do it by 11, she said. She was back down the stairs before he answered. The ride back was faster than the ride in, which she would not have thought possible. And when she pulled into the yard, Benjamin was already at the gate with Pete beside him, and the particular readiness of men who have been waiting for news and have spent the wait doing something useful to keep from thinking. She climbed down before the wagon stopped moving. "Aldred needs you and Bill Nessing at his office by 11, she said. "There's a statute. The proxy may be voidable." Benjamin looked at Pete. "Ride to Nessing's," he said. "Tell him what happened and bring him in. Take the bay." Pete was on the horse in 45 seconds. Benjamin turned to Lillian. She was already dusty from the road, and her hair had come partly loose, and she was breathing hard from the pace she'd kept, and she looked, he thought, standing there in his yard watching her, like someone who had arrived at the center of herself and was operating from exactly that place, with nothing spare, nothing wasted, nothing held back. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Get your coat." "We need to leave in 20 minutes. He almost said something. He put on his coat instead. They made Aldred's office at 10:47. Pete arrived with Bill Nessing 8 minutes later. Bill Nessing was a large, soft-spoken man of about 50, with the weathered look of someone who had worked land his entire life, and the particular shame of a man who has been taken advantage of and knows it, and cannot quite meet people's eyes because of it. He sat in Aldred's office and turned his hat in his hands and said, "I thought it was a loan document." Nathan said it was a loan document. He said it would help me through the winter if the cattle prices dropped. He stopped. "I can't, I have trouble with the reading. Long documents." "I should have had someone look at it, Mr. Nessing," Aldred said. "Did Mr. Whitlock know you have trouble reading?" Bill Nessing looked at his hat. "Yes," he said. "I've told him before. When he had documents at the boarding house receipts, and such, I've asked him to read them to me." The room went very quiet. "He read this one to you?" Aldred said. "He told me what it said," Bill said. "He didn't read it word for word." "And what he told you it said, did that match what I've just told you it actually says?" Bill Nessing looked up. His eyes were tired and embarrassed and angry all at once. "No," he said, "it does not." Aldred made a note. Benjamin, sitting beside Lillian, did not move or speak. He had his hands flat on his knees, and he was watching Aldred the way he watched everything that mattered with the full attention of a man who had learned that the details were where things were won or lost. Lillian was watching Bill Nessing. She was thinking about the particular cruelty of targeting the vulnerability a person has trusted you with. Bill Nessing had told Whitlock about his reading difficulty in the context of needing help, and Whitlock had filed it away like a tool. She knew something about being a vulnerability that someone decided to use. "Mr. Nessing," she said quietly. He looked at her. "This is not your fault," she said. "You trusted someone you had reason to trust. That's not a failing. What he did with that trust is." Bill Nessing looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. It was small, that nod. But it straightened his spine a little, and he sat differently in the chair after it, and Lillian thought that sometimes the most important thing a person could give another person was simply the accurate version of what had happened to them. Aldred filed the voidability petition that afternoon. He also, and this was the piece that Lillian would only learn about later, secondhand from Pete, who heard it from Briggs, who heard it from the sheriff's deputy, sent a separate letter to the territorial court in Helena, documenting a pattern of behavior. The legal notice against Lillian, the proxy obtained through misrepresentation. Both actions taken immediately following business losses that Whitlock had attributed, in public, to Benjamin Carter. The letter used the word fraud carefully and only once. But once was enough. By Friday, the territorial court had assigned a circuit judge to review the matter. Whitlock found out on Saturday. By Saturday evening, he had withdrawn both the voidable proxy and what remained of the legal complaint, and had done so through a lawyer from the county seat, which meant he had done it quietly and without a public announcement that would have allowed him to spin the withdrawal as something other than what it was. He had lost, not loudly, not dramatically, not in the grain hall with 40 witnesses the way the first loss had happened, but thoroughly, in the particular quiet, thorough way that legal losses happen when the record is clean and the other side has done everything correctly, and the judge simply looks at the documents and draws the only conclusion available. Benjamin heard the news from Aldred on Monday morning. He came home and told Lillian. She was in the garden, the late-season beans were coming in, and she'd been picking them since early morning, working her way along the rows with a basket hooked over her arm. And she was bent over the plants when she heard his boots coming across the yard. She straightened. She looked at his face. She knew before he spoke. "It's done," he said. She stood in the garden with a basket of beans on her arm, and she let out a breath that she had been holding, she realized, for the better part of 3 weeks, not consciously, not dramatically. Just the steady low-grade tension of a person who has been braced for the next blow and can finally unclench. "All of it," she said. "Proxy voided. Complaint withdrawn. Aldred says the circuit judge's review will be a formality at this point." "Whitlock's finished with it." She nodded. She looked down at the beans in her basket. "Good," she said. It was the same word he'd used in the mercantile when she'd told Whitlock to speak less. She used it the same way he had, not small, not casual, but compressed. Everything that needed to be said in a single syllable. He understood it. He sat down on the garden fence, just hooked his boot on the bottom rail, and settled his weight against the top one, and watched her go back to picking beans. And neither of them spoke for a while. And the silence was so thoroughly comfortable that it took Lillian a moment to recognize it for what it was. Peace. Simple, undefended, unworked for peace. She hadn't felt it in so long she'd half forgotten the texture of it. "Benjamin," she said, without looking up from the plants. "Yes, I need to tell you something." She heard him go still on the fence. "All right," he said. She kept picking. It was easier to say difficult things when her hands had something to do. "When I came here," she said, "I told you I'd work for a wage and move on when I had enough saved. I meant it when I said it." She paused. "I don't mean it now." The garden was very quiet. "Are you telling me you're staying?" he said. "I'm telling you I want to stay," she said. "Those are different things. One of them is a decision, and one of them is a question." A long pause. "What's the question?" She stopped picking. She stood up and turned around, and looked at him directly, the way she had looked at Eliza Hendricks, and at Nathan Whitlock, and at 400 people in the grain hall without pretense, without performance. Just the clear, straight look of a woman who had decided that honesty was the only strategy she trusted. "Whether you want me to," she said. Benjamin Carter sat on the garden fence and looked at her. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the particular vulnerability of having said the true thing and having to wait for the world to respond to it. Then he said, "I fixed the porch last week." She blinked. "I noticed," she said, uncertain where he was going. "I fixed it," he said, "because I wanted it to be right. Because someone was going to be sitting on it in the evenings, and I wanted it to hold." He paused. "I didn't ask myself whose porch it was when I fixed it." She looked at him. "Benjamin," she said, "I've been alone for 6 years," he said. "I got good at it. Got so good at it, I stopped noticing it wasn't what I wanted." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "You noticed things about this place inside of 20 minutes that I'd stopped seeing years ago. You put warmth back in a house I'd been treating like a structure. You walked into a mercantile and faced a man down, and then drove 12 miles at full speed to save a land agreement, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped thinking about you as someone passing through." He stopped. "Stay," he said. "Not for the wage. Not because you don't have anywhere else. Stay because this is your place too now. And I'd like to see what we build when we're not spending all our energy on Nathan Whitlock." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set her basket of beans down in the dirt. She walked to the fence where he was sitting, and she stood in front of him, and she said, "All right." Just that all right. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just took it the way you take hold of something you've decided to keep. She let him. They stood like that in the garden for a while, with the beans ripening on the vines around them and the Montana mountains going blue and enormous against the sky behind the fence. And neither of them needed to say anything more, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the rest of it, all of it, the long unwritten rest of it, was ahead of them. It was Pete who broke the moment, because Pete had a gift for that. He appeared around the corner of the barn with a look on his face that was trying to be neutral, and was very comprehensively failing. "Boss," he said, "Harlan's got a question about the east fence." Benjamin looked at him. Pete looked at the ceiling of the sky. "Tell Harlan I'll be there in 10 minutes, Benjamin said. "Yes, sir," Pete said, and disappeared with the speed of a man who has seen what he came to see and is content. Lillian laughed. It came out before she could stop at a real laugh, full and warm and entirely unguarded, and it surprised her the way her own voice always surprised her when it came from somewhere she hadn't been visiting lately. Benjamin looked at her. Something in his face went loose, she thought. The last locked thing in it went loose. "He's going to be insufferable about this," Lillian said. "He already is," Benjamin said. "He was insufferable about it, before it was even anything." "Was it not anything before?" she asked. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It was always something." She picked up her basket. She went back to the beans. He went to find Harlan. The days that followed were different in a way that everyone on the Carter Ranch felt, but nobody announced, because nobody needed to. The change was not dramatic. It was the change of a pressure releasing, of a thing that had been held at careful distance, finally allowed to be what it was. Benjamin ate breakfast with the men now, every morning, at the table in the house kitchen. He had done this occasionally before when the weather was particularly bad, or the day ahead was complicated enough to need a planning conversation, but now he did it every day, and it was not about the weather or the planning. It was about the fact that Lillian made coffee at 6:15 and had a habit of saying something dry about whoever had tracked the most mud in the night before, and the hands had developed a competing theory about whose boots were the culprit. And the conversation that resulted was, Benjamin had decided, worth getting up for. He was not, the ranch hands noted to each other privately, the same man he'd been 6 weeks ago. Not softer, exactly. Still as direct, still the first one working and the last one done. But something in the set of him had changed, some held-back quality had released itself, and the result was a man who laughed occasionally, which was new, and who could sometimes be found standing on the porch in the evening for no practical reason, which was extremely new, and who had fixed not just the porch, but the leaking roof on the north side and the cracked window pane in the upstairs hall, and the gate hinge on the south corral that had been complaining for 2 years. Pete, observing all of this, said nothing to anyone except Harlan, and what he said to Harlan was, "I told you." Harlan said, "You didn't tell me anything. You never said a word." "I didn't have to," Pete said. "Anyone with eyes could see it." Harlan thought about this. "How long?" he said. "How long what?" "How long before Harlan made a vague gesture." Pete looked at the house. "He's already there," Pete said. "Has been for a while. He just needed someone to hold still long enough for him to admit it." The town, for its part, adjusted. Not all at once and not without friction, but the way communities adjust when the dominant narrative has been publicly dismantled, and the people who held it have to find somewhere to put what's left. Margaret Cole from the dress shop stopped in at the Mercantile one Tuesday and mentioned to Briggs that she intended to invite Miss Harper to the County Women's Charitable Society meeting the following month. Briggs passed this along to Harlan on the next supply run. Harlan told Pete. Pete told Benjamin, who told Lillian. Lillian was at the kitchen table doing accounts when she heard. She set down her pencil. "Margaret Cole," she said. "That's what Pete said," Benjamin said. "The woman who wrote me that letter." "Yes, the one who stood up at the meeting and apologized. Yes, Lillian picked her pencil back up. I'll go, she said. Benjamin looked at her. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. There are women in this county who are going to judge me regardless of what I do or don't do. The ones who might stop judging me if I show up and do the work are more important than the ones who won't. She made a note in the ledger. Besides, the charitable society probably needs someone who can manage accounts. Benjamin looked at her for a moment. You're going to run that society within a year, he said. 2 years, she said. I'm not rushing anything. He laughed. It was the full kind, the unguarded kind. She kept writing. The Hendricks land was formally transferred into Benjamin's name on the last Thursday of August, and Eliza Hendricks drove herself the 30 miles in her buggy to watch Aldred file the final papers. Which nobody had asked her to do, but which everyone understood was a statement she had chosen to make. She signed as a witness. She shook Benjamin's hand. She looked at Lillian. You're good stock, she said. You're people from Ohio? Yes, ma'am, Lillian said. Ohio people are hard-headed, Eliza said. I mean that as a compliment. I take it as one, Lillian said. Eliza drove herself back 30 miles without stopping. The circuit judge from Helena arrived the following week and spent 2 days reviewing Aldred's documentation on the Whitlock matter. He met with the sheriff. He reviewed the registry correspondence. He looked at the proxy document and the timeline of its signing. He interviewed Bill Nessing. On the second day, he summoned Nathan Whitlock. Lillian was not in the room for that meeting. She heard about it afterward from Aldred, who had been present and who described it with the particular compressed neutrality of a man who found a great deal of professional satisfaction in saying very little. The judge reviewed the pattern of conduct, Aldred said. He noted that the legal notice against you was filed without merit, that the proxy was obtained through deliberate exploitation of a known limitation, and that both actions followed from the same underlying motivation, which is to say, business competition conducted through personal destruction rather than legitimate means. What did he say to Whitlock? Benjamin asked. Aldred paused. Aldred said carefully, that a man who uses the law as a weapon against people who have done nothing to him should not be surprised when the law eventually looks at him in return. Benjamin was quiet. That's all, Lillian said. The judge issued a formal censure, Aldred said, and referred the matter to the territorial bar regarding the individual who drafted the original legal notice, since that individual represented himself as having legal credentials he does not, in fact, possess. He paused. Whitlock is not in legal jeopardy himself at this stage. But the censure is public record and his associate is. Will it matter? Lillian asked. In a territory where business runs on reputation, Aldred said. Miss Harper, a public censure from a circuit judge is not a small thing. Nathan Whitlock will conduct business differently going forward, or he will find that conducting it at all becomes increasingly difficult. Lillian thought about the man who had stood on the train platform with his arms crossed and a grin spreading slow across his face. She thought about her mother's sewing box shattering on the boards. She thought about 40 people watching. Good, she said. She said it the same way she always said it. It meant the same thing it always meant. On the 1st of September, Benjamin asked her to walk with him to the east pasture at evening. She went. They walked out to the boundary of the Hendricks land, his land now, 60 acres of river-fed grassland going gold in the late-season light, and he stood for a while just looking at it. She stood beside him and let him look. My father ran cattle in this territory for 30 years, he said. He never owned more than 40 acres. He always said the river grass land north of town was the land worth having. He died before he could get it. He paused. I told him I'd get it. She looked at him. You did, she said. We did, he said. She was quiet. I want to tell you something, he said. About Clara. She went still, not tense, just still, giving him the full space of the moment. You don't have to, she said. I know I don't, he said. I want to. He turned to look at her. She was a good woman. She was patient and kind, and she loved this ranch, and she would have been a good mother. Losing her was he stopped. Started again. I spent 6 years making sure I was too busy to feel it. And it worked, mostly. Until you sat down in my kitchen and started writing inventory at midnight like you'd always been there. Lillian looked at him. I'm not asking you to forget her, she said quietly. I know you're not. He looked at the river grass land. I'm telling you, because you deserve to know what you walked into. This place carries weight. I carry weight. I'm not an easy man. Benjamin, she said. He looked at her. I've been invisible most of my life, she said. I've been unwanted and overlooked and told my worth was in what I could offer rather than who I was. I didn't come west looking for easy, she paused. I came west looking for real. And you are the most real thing I have ever encountered. He looked at her for a long time. I don't have the words for what he stopped. Then don't use words, she said. He reached out and took her face in both hands, carefully, the way you handle something you understand to be irreplaceable. And he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been living inside of for 6 years, without knowing he was asking it. He kissed her, gentle, certain, unhurried. She kissed him back. Around them the Montana evening was going purple and enormous, and the cattle were moving through the river grass somewhere to the north, and the ranch behind them was lit with lamplight, and loud with the sound of the hands finishing the day's work. And none of it stopped, none of it held its breath, none of it made ceremony out of the moment. The world just kept going, and they stood in it together. When they walked back to the ranch, they walked close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved apart. And by the time they reached the yard, Harlan was coming out of the barn and stopped dead when he saw them, and then turned around and went back inside very quickly. They heard him say something to Pete. They heard Pete say, I know. Lillian shook her head. 2 years, she said quietly. I said 2 years before I ran the charitable society. That's reasonable, Benjamin said. The ranch hands are going to be impossible. They already are, he said. They were impossible before I knew I was in love with you. They'll be worse now. She stopped walking, she turned and looked at him. He looked back at her with the straight, direct gaze of a man who has said the exact thing he meant to say and is not interested in taking it back. In love with me, she said. Yes, he said. Have been for a while. Figured you knew. I suspected, she said. And he said. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had stepped forward on a train platform when 40 people stepped back, who had driven to a territorial office and pulled correspondence records before she knew there was a problem, who had gone to town with a lawyer, and to a widow's kitchen and to a grain hall and to a garden fence, who had fixed the porch and the roof and the window, who had said we and home and stay and all right in the particular way that made each word mean everything. And I love you back, she said. Have for a while. Figured you knew. The corner of his mouth moved. I suspected, he said. She laughed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they walked across the yard to the house, and Pete and Harlan were absolutely not watching from the bunkhouse window, and the kitchen lamp was burning warm and yellow in the evening. And the porch he had fixed held both their weights without complaint when they sat down on it at the end of the night and watched the stars come through in the Montana dark. Lillian thought about Ohio, about the town that no longer existed except in county records, about the train, about a platform and a broken sewing box and a man with his arms crossed waiting for her to be small enough to disappear. She thought about how she had not disappeared. She thought about the room at the top of the stairs. She thought about all the things she had built in 60 days out of nothing except determination and a stub of pencil and more spine than anyone on that platform had given her credit for. She thought, I am not invisible. And beside her, Benjamin Carter sat on the porch he had fixed, because someone was going to be sitting on it, and he looked at the stars the way a man looks at something he had forgotten the beauty of and has just remembered. And he thought about 60 acres of river-fed grassland, and a woman who had filled an empty house with warmth and a fight worth fighting, and a laugh he had not heard in that yard in 6 years, and that he had no intention of going without again. He reached over without looking at her. She put her hand in his without looking at him. They sat. The Montana dark held them. Everything that had been empty was full. The first frost came early that year. Lillian felt it before she saw it, the particular quality of the air when she opened the kitchen's door at 5 in the morning, sharp and clean and carrying the smell of something ending and something else beginning at the same time. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her coffee cup in both hands and breathed it in, and she thought about Ohio in October and the way the cold had always felt like a warning there. Like the world contracting around you, like something closing. It didn't feel like that here. Here it felt like a door opening. She heard Benjamin's boots behind her. He came and stood in the doorway beside her and looked out at the yard the same way she was looking, and she handed him the coffee cup without speaking, and he took it and drank and handed it back, and that small exchange the cup. The warmth of his hand where her hands had been, the easy unconscious sharing of it was so thoroughly domestic, so quietly certain, that Lillian felt the particular fullness of a life that has found its right shape. "Frost," he said. "Garden? I brought in the last to the squash yesterday," she said. "We're fine," he nodded. "Cattle need moving off the north pasture this week," he said. "I know Pete mentioned it yesterday." She paused. "I told him I'd ride out with you on Thursday if you needed another set of eyes on the river boundary." He looked at her. She looked at him. "You ride?" he said. "I do now," she said. "Harlan's been teaching me for 3 weeks." "I thought you knew." He had not known. He stared at her. "Harlan's been..." He stopped. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because I asked them not to," she said. "I wanted to be able to actually ride before I told you I was learning. I didn't want to make a claim I couldn't back up." He was still staring. "Can you actually ride?" he said. "Reasonably well," she said. "I'm not going to outrun anyone. But I can keep up." He took the coffee cup back from her, drank the last of it, and set it on the porch rail. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed. He went to the barn. Lillian went back to the kitchen, and she was smiling that small, controlled smile she used when something delighted her, and she did not want to make a production of it, and she picked up her pencil and opened her notebook to the day's list. The notebook had changed over the months. In the beginning, it had been inventory and accounts, the practical language of a woman establishing herself in an unfamiliar place. Then it had grown to include household planning, garden records, the charitable society meetings she had been attending since September, correspondence she was managing on the ranch's behalf. Now it held all of that and more, and the handwriting in it had changed to looser, she thought, than it had been at the beginning. Less careful, more like someone who trusted the paper to hold whatever she put on it. She was on her second notebook. She had filled the first one completely. October moved through the Carter Ranch with the particular energy of a season that has work in it and doesn't apologize for the fact. The cattle were moved. The fencing on the north boundary was inspected and reinforced. The cellar was stocked with the last of the garden produce, organized with the specificity that Lillian brought to anything she considered worth doing properly. The roof that had been repaired before the fall rains held through 3 hard storms without complaint. The porch held every evening. They had fallen into a habit that neither of them had designed, and neither of them would have given up. Every evening when the work was finished, they sat on the porch. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Benjamin would have his coffee and Lillian would have hers, and they would watch whatever the Montana sky was doing, sometimes nothing, sometimes everything, and the day would close around them in the particular quiet of 2 people who have found that the other's silence is as good as conversation. Pete had stopped pretending he wasn't sentimental about it. One evening he came out of the bunkhouse and found Harlan sitting on the step looking toward the main house porch, and Pete sat down beside him, and they both just sat there for a moment. "You know," Harlan said, "I've been on 3 ranches and I never saw anything like this." "Like what?" Pete said. Like Harlan waved a hand. "Like that." like two people who just fit. Pete was quiet for a moment. They do fit, he said. That's the truth of it. How'd he know? Harlan said. At the station. How'd he know she was the one to step forward for? Pete thought about it. I don't think he knew, Pete said. I think he just knew he couldn't walk away, and that turned out to be enough. Harlan considered this. That's a good story, he said. It's not a story, Pete said. It's what happened. He stood and went back inside. The charitable society meeting in October was the fourth one Lillian had attended, and it was the first one where she stood up and spoke without being asked. The matter before the society was a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had been widowed in August, and had 3 children under the age of 10 and a homestead claim that was at risk because her husband had been the one to file it, and the territorial rules around widowed women and property inheritance were, to say the least, inadequate. The society had been discussing the situation for 20 minutes in the circular, well-meaning way of groups that care about a problem, but cannot agree on who should actually solve it. Lillian stood up. Margaret Cole, who had been chairing the meeting, looked at her. Miss Harper, she said. Mrs. Carter, Lillian said, and the room went briefly, noticeably quiet, because she had been Miss Harper at every previous meeting, and this was the first time she had used the other name in public, and everyone present understood what it meant. Margaret Cole recovered first. Mrs. Carter, she said, and there was something warm in how she said it. Please, Lillian said, the homestead claim can be preserved. There is a provision in territorial law for continuation of a claim under widowed circumstances if a legal representative files within 90 days of the original claimant's death. Ruth Calloway's husband died in August. We are in October. She has time. She paused. What she needs is someone to file on her behalf and someone to cover the filing fee. I'll manage the filing through Aldred's office. The society should cover the fee. A silence. Then a woman in the second row said, How do you know about the territorial provision? I read the territorial land statutes, Lillian said. I had reason to last summer. Another silence. Then Margaret Cole said, All in favor of covering the Calloway filing fee? Every hand in the room went up, including Margaret's own. After the meeting, as people were leaving, Margaret caught Lillian at the door. Mrs. Carter, she said. Mrs. Cole, Lillian said. Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to state. I was wrong about you, Margaret said. Not just the letter. I was wrong from the beginning. I saw a woman arrive under difficult circumstances, and I decided what kind of woman that made her before I had a single fact. She paused. I'd like to not do that again. Lillian looked at her. Then don't, she said simply, without cruelty and without excess grace. Just the plain statement of what was possible. Margaret nodded. The society meets first Tuesday of the month, she said. I'd like you to stay involved. I intend to, Lillian said. She went out to where Benjamin was waiting with the wagon. He looked at her face. Good meeting, said. Very, she said. She climbed up. Ruth Calloway's homestead claim is going to be saved. That the widow out on the East Road? Yes, he looked at her. You managed that, he said. The society managed it, she said. I just knew what tool to use. He picked up the reins. 2 years, he said, to no one in particular. What, she said. You said 2 years before you ran the charitable society. I'm revising the estimate. She looked at him. How long, she said. You'll be running it by spring, he said. She considered arguing. She didn't. She was probably right. The proposal happened in November. And it happened the way most significant things happened between them, without ceremony, without performance, in the middle of something ordinary. They were in the kitchen. Benjamin was at the table with the ranch accounts spread in front of him, the year-end accounting that he had always done alone, and that Lillian had begun sitting in on in October. Because she had reorganized the ledger system in September and had strong opinions about the way the feed costs were being categorized. They were going through the numbers line by line and arguing companionably about whether the cost of the new fence wire should be amortized over 2 years or 3 when Benjamin put down his pencil. Lillian looked up. He was looking at her. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, not a speech. Just those 2 words, direct and unhurried, the way he said everything that mattered most. She looked at him. "We're in the middle of the accounts," she said. "I know," he said. "The fence wire question is unresolved." "I know that too," he said. "Marry me anyway." She set down her own pencil. She looked at him across the spread of ledger pages and account records and the particular beautiful evidence of a life that had been built into something real. And she thought about the train and the platform and the broken sewing box and the 40 people who had watched her on her knees in the dirt. And she thought about a room at the top of the stairs and a first frost and a coffee cup passed between 2 people in a doorway and 60 acres of river-fed grassland and a porch that had been fixed because someone was going to be sitting on it. She thought, "I came west looking for real." "Yes," she said. He picked up his pencil. 2 years or 3 on the fence wire," he said. She stared at him. 3, she said, "obviously 3. "I thought 2, he said. "Then you thought wrong," she said. He was writing. She was smiling. They finished the accounts. They were married in December, in the grain hall where the town meeting had been held, which Lillian had chosen deliberately, and which Benjamin had agreed to without question, because he understood, as he understood most things about her, exactly why it mattered. She wanted to stand in the same room where she had stood as an accused woman, and stand there this time as something else. Not as a correction to that night had ended correctly, but as a continuation of it. The same woman, the same hall, the same county watching, and a different chapter opening. The ceremony was small by the standards of the territory. Aldred stood up as a witness. Eliza Hendricks drove 30 miles for the second time in 4 months. Pete Granger wore his good shirt, which nobody had seen before, and stood beside Harlan, who was trying very hard not to cry and failing in a way that everyone was politely ignoring. Margaret Cole brought food. Half the county showed up to eat it. Ruth Calloway came with her 3 children. Carl Briggs from the Mercantile shook Benjamin's hand and said, "I always thought you needed someone to keep your accounts in order." "She reorganized my entire ledger system," Benjamin said. "Good," Briggs said. "Your categories were a mess." Lillian, standing nearby, laughed. Bill Nessing was there too. He had driven in from his property, and he was quiet, the way he was always quiet, but he found Lillian before the afternoon was over, and he stood in front of her and said, "I heard what you said at the lawyer's office." About it not being my fault, he stopped. "I've been thinking about that for 2 months. "Have you made peace with it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Getting there," he said. "Thought you should know you helped." She put her hand out. He shook it. He went back to his wife. The only person who was not there was Nathan Whitlock. Whitlock had been quieter since the circuit judge's censure. Not gone, he still had his boarding house and his piece of the Mercantile, and his presence in the town, but changed in the way pen change when the story they've been telling about themselves has been publicly contradicted, and they have. To find a new story that accounts for what happened. Lillian had not seen him since the grain hall meeting in September. She thought about him occasionally, not with anger, not anymore, but with the particular clear-eyed understanding of a woman who has been forced to study an opponent closely enough to see past the cruelty into the smallness underneath it. Nathan Whitlock was a frightened man. He had been frightened of irrelevance, of being outmaneuvered, of having his name mean less than he'd decided it should. He had used that fear as fuel for everything he'd done, and the fire had burned him more thoroughly than it had burned anyone else. She did not wish him further harm. She did not wish him anything much. She simply did not think about him very often anymore, which was, she had decided, the most complete form of resolution available. The winter of 1000 884 settled over the Carter Ranch, with the full weight of a Montana winter, heavy and long and completely indifferent to human preference, and Lillian met it the way she met everything, with preparation, with practicality, and with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided that cold is a condition and not a verdict. The house was different in winter than it had been in any other season. The stove ran hotter, and the kitchen smelled of things that took time: stews and bread, and the dried herbs she'd hung from the ceiling rafters in September. The ranch hands ate inside every meal, and the table that had once felt too large for its room now felt exactly right, filled with voices and argument and the occasional story that Pete told so badly it became funny for entirely the wrong reasons. Benjamin came in earlier when the days were short. Sometimes he brought work with him harnessed to repair, account books, plans for the spring cattle drive, and sometimes he just came in and sat and drank his coffee and watched Lillian move around the kitchen with the particular ease of a man who has stopped being surprised by the fact that this is his life and started simply living it. One January evening, she was mending one of Harlan's shirts. He went through shirts at a rate that defied explanation, and Benjamin was at the table with the spring drive planning spread in front of him. And the house was quiet around them in the best possible way, and Lillian looked up from the mending and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're staring." "I'm allowed," he said. "You're my wife." She went back to the mending. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes, I want to talk to you about something." She heard him set down his pencil. "All right," he said. She kept her eyes on the mending. "The Charitable Society has been discussing the situation for women arriving in the territory, without proper legal standing," she said. "Wives, widows, single women with homestead claims. The territorial laws are inadequate. There are women in worse situations than Ruth Calloway, and they don't have a society looking out for them." She paused. "I've been corresponding with a woman in Helena who is working with the territorial legislature on a revision to the property inheritance statutes. She needs people in individual counties who can document cases and submit testimony." "Silence. You want to do that," he said. "I think I should," she said. "I know what the law says, and I know what it fails to do, and I have standing now that I didn't have in August. People in this county listen to me. I think I should use that." Another silence. "How much time?" he said. "Correspondence, mostly. Occasional trips to Helena when the legislature is in session. Aldred has agreed to help with the legal documentation." She looked up. He was watching her with the same open expression he'd worn in the garden, on the porch, at the east pasture fence. The expression without the careful distance in it. "Do it," he said. "Just that? You don't want to think about it?" she said. "I thought about it while you were explaining it," he said. "Do it." She looked at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "when I arrived here I was trying to be useful enough that you wouldn't regret taking me in." "I know," he said. "I'm not doing that anymore." "I know that, too," he said. "You stopped about 3 days in," she laughed. 4 days, she said. 3, he said. "The inventory," she said. "The inventory," he agreed. She went back to the mending. He went back to the spring drive planning. The fire in the stove ticked and the house breathed around them, and outside the Montana winter did what it always did, enormous and indifferent and strangely beautiful. And inside the Carter ranch house 2 people sat in the warmth they had made together, and worked in comfortable silence, and did not need anything more than this. Spring came back the way it always did in Montana, not gradually, not politely, but suddenly and with tremendous energy, like something that had been held back too long and was making up for lost time. The garden went in early. Lillian had spent the winter planning it properly: the full kitchen garden, the expanded beds along the south fence, the herb section along the back wall that Mrs. Albright had kept and that Lillian had decided to restore in full. She had ordered seed from a catalog in February and had spent 3 evenings in March at the kitchen table with a hand-drawn plan of the beds, and Benjamin sitting across from her offering opinions on squash varieties that she accepted or rejected, based on criteria he found entirely opaque and entirely trustworthy. Pete and Harlan both ended up helping with the garden, which nobody had planned. It happened the way most things happened on the Carter Ranch. Someone saw work that needed doing and did it, and the fact that the work was garden work rather than cattle or fence work seemed, after the first morning, not to matter very much. Pete turned out to have opinions about bean planting depth. Nobody had known this about Pete. "You grew up farming," Lillian said, watching him. "Missouri," he said. "Family had a farm. I left when I was 17. "Do you miss it?" "Not the farm," he said. "The growing things." "Yeah, a little." She handed him the next row marker. "Then grow things," she said. He looked at her. "I'm a ranch hand," he said. "You're a person," she said. "Ranch hand is what you do. Growing things is something else." She pushed a seed into the soil. "Nobody should be only one thing, Mr. Granger." Pete planted beans. He planted them every spring after that. The territorial legislature passed a revised property statute in the spring of 1885, and among the changes was a provision that had been documented, argued for, and submitted to the legislature by a committee of 12 women from 7 Montana counties, organized and largely written by a woman in Red Hollow named Lillian Carter, who had arrived in the territory 8 months earlier with nothing but a broken sewing box and more determination than anyone had given her credit for. The provision allowed widowed women to continue homestead claims in their own names without requiring a male cosigner or legal representative, and it established a 30-day notice period before any contested claim could be filed, giving affected parties time to seek legal counsel. Ruth Calloway's homestead was the first property officially secured under the new provision. The letter informing Lillian of the passage came on a Thursday afternoon, carried out from town by Harlan, who had learned to recognize the difference between correspondence that was routine and correspondence that was not, and who set this particular envelope on the kitchen table in front of Lillian with the careful respect of someone handling something that matters. She read it once. She read it again. She sat with it for a moment. Then she went out to the barn where Benjamin was working. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. He saw her face. He set down what he was holding and crossed the barn in 6 steps and took the letter from her hand and read it, and she watched his face as he read it, the particular focused attention, the moment of understanding. And then the thing that happened after understanding, which was not just satisfaction but something deeper, something that she recognized because she had felt it herself and had not had words for until now. Pride. He was proud of her. Not surprised. Not impressed in the patronizing way of someone who expected less. Just proud. The way you are proud of someone you love who has done a hard thing and done it completely. He handed the letter back. "Lillian," he said, "yes. When I stepped forward on that platform," he said, "I told myself I was doing it because nobody else was going to." "I know," she said. "That was true," he said, "but it wasn't the whole truth." She looked at him. "What was the rest?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you stand up," he said, "after you fell. I watched you gather your things and stand up and face Whitlock, and I thought, that is the most courage I have seen on this platform. And nobody here is seeing it, because they've already decided what kind of woman steps off a train with nothing." He paused. "I stepped forward because I wanted to be on the right side of the story." "Yours," she looked at him for a long time. "You were," she said. "I know," he said. "I got lucky." "We both did," she said. He pulled her toward him and she went, and he held her with the easy certainty of someone who has stopped being surprised by how much they need a thing and started simply being grateful for it. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she had not been able to do without reservation for a very long time, and which still, months into this, felt like a small miracle every time. "We should celebrate," he said into her hair. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Tell Pete," he said. "He'll make it a bigger deal than it needs to be, and Harlan will try to make a toast, and the toast will be terrible. And it'll be the best evening we've had in a while." She laughed into his shoulder. "That's your idea of celebrating," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is that all right?" She pulled back and looked at him. "It's Perfect, she said. She was right. Pete made it a bigger deal than it needed to be. Harlan's toast was terrible. The evening was the best they'd had in a while. Eliza Hendricks had been in town on an errand, and Pete had apparently sent Harlan to find her. Because she arrived at the Carter Ranch in her buggy at 7 o'clock, with a bottle of something she had been saving for an occasion, and announced that she had decided this was it. Ruth Calloway came too. She had heard from the Society's correspondence chain and had come straight from her homestead, 3 children in the back of her wagon. And she stood in the Carter Ranch kitchen, and she held Lillian's hands, and she said, "You know what you did, don't you?" Lillian looked at her. "I helped," she said. "You changed it," Ruth said. "For my children. For their children. The law is different now because of what you did, and that doesn't go away." Lillian stood in her kitchen, the kitchen she had scrubbed clean on the first day. The kitchen she had brought back from cold emptiness into warmth and use, and the daily productive noise of a household that was alive, and she felt the full weight of what Ruth had said and did not try to make it smaller. "We changed it," she said. "The 12 of us. The women who documented their cases and signed their names." "You organized 12 women from 7 counties," Ruth said. "Give yourself the credit." She squeezed Lillian's hands and went to find her children. Lillian stood still for a moment. Benjamin appeared beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm just thinking about something." "What?" "The platform," she said, "that morning. If Whitlock hadn't rejected me. If you hadn't stepped forward, if any of it had gone differently." She paused. "I would have gotten back on the train, gone back to Cheyenne. Tried to find work. And don't," he said gently. She looked at him. "Don't spend time in the version of events that didn't happen," he said. "This one is good enough." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." By the end of 1885, the Carter Ranch had expanded to include the full Hendricks parcel, a leased grazing contract with 2 neighboring operations, and a cattle count that had increased by 40% over the previous year. Benjamin had hired 2 additional hands and had plans for a second barn going in the following spring. The east pasture fencing was the best in the county. The river grassland was everything his father had said it would be. The kitchen garden was, Pete privately considered, the finest kitchen garden in Montana. Though he was careful not to say this too loudly, because Lillian would ask him to expand it, and he was already spending more time with the bean rows than he strictly had time for. Lillian's correspondence network had grown into something that operated independently of her 12 women in 7 counties who had started filing documentation cases on their own, following the process she had mapped out, and who wrote to each other with the particular organized energy of people who have discovered that the law can be made to serve them if they learn its language. She was teaching 3 of them by letter how to read territorial statutes. Ruth Calloway's oldest daughter had started visiting the ranch on Saturday mornings because she wanted to learn to keep accounts. She was 9 years old. Lillian gave her a notebook and a pencil and sat with her at the kitchen table every Saturday for an hour. Benjamin watched this one morning from the doorway and then went quietly out to the barn. And Pete found him there 10 minutes later, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who is too full of something to express it through speech. "Boss," Pete said. You all right?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "She's teaching that girl to read accounts," he said. "I know," Pete said. "I can hear them from the yard." "She's 9 years old," Benjamin said. "Yes, sir." "In 10 years, that girl is going to be managing her mother's homestead," Benjamin said. "In 20 years, she's going to be—" He stopped. "Yes, sir," Pete said. Benjamin looked at him. "She changed everything, Pete," he said. "From the beginning. She just changed everything." Pete thought about a summer morning and a train platform and 40 people watching a woman on her knees. He thought about the 10 steps across a platform. He thought about 3 words. "You both did," Pete said. "That's the truth of it." Benjamin looked at him for a long moment. He nodded. He went back to work. That evening, late, After the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Ruth Calloway's daughter had gone home with her sums completed and her notebook tucked under her arm, Benjamin and Lillian sat on the porch in the last warmth of the year before the deep cold came back. Lillian had her coffee. Benjamin had it. The Montana sky was doing something extraordinary, purple and gold along the western edge where the last light was going, and then deeper, and then the first stars coming through, enormous and certain, the way they always did out here, as though they had been there all day and had simply been waiting for the dark. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you what I wrote in my notebook the night of the grain hall meeting." He looked at her. "The 3 words," she said. "I told you I closed the notebook." "I never told you what they were." He was quiet. "Tell me," he said. She looked at the stars. "I am seen," she said. The porch was silent. He reached over. She put her hand in his. "You are," he said. She looked at him, this man who had crossed a platform in 10 steps and changed both their lives without knowing it, who had carried grief for 6 years and chosen to put it down, who had said we and home and stay and do it, and I love you and marry me in the particular plain language of someone who had decided that the true thing was always worth saying. And she thought about everything that had been empty and was full now, and everything that had been silent and was warm now, and the room at the top of the stairs that was hers, that had always been hers from the moment he said it, and the porch that he had fixed because someone was going to be sitting on it, and 60 acres of river-fed grassland, and a kitchen garden, and a 9-year-old girl learning accounts on Saturday mornings, and 12 women in 7 counties filing legal documentation, and a territorial statute with a provision in it that would protect women who came west with nothing except courage and the willingness to stand back up. She thought, I came 2,000 miles looking for a place where someone would see me as a human being. She thought I found it. She looked at Benjamin Carter, rancher, widower, the man who stepped forward when 40 people stepped back, and she thought about what a life could be when it was built not on what a person owned or what they could offer, but on what they were willing to become for each other. She held his hand. The Montana dark held them both. And the Carter Ranch, alive and warm, and full of the particular light of a house where people who love each other are simply going about the business of their days, stood against the November cold and did not yield, and would not yield. Because it had been built by 2 people who understood that the most permanent things are not the ones made of timber and stone, but the ones made of choice, made of courage, made of the stubborn refusal to let the world tell you that you are worth less than you know yourself to be. Lillian Harper had stepped off a train with a broken sewing box and a Bible, and 2,000 miles of determination behind her. She had been thrown away in front of 40 witnesses. She had gotten back up. She had built something, and the West, that vast, indifferent, sometimes brutal, and sometimes magnificent West, had looked at what she built, and it had seen her, fully and finally, and it had not looked away. That was everything. That was exactly enough. That was the whole of it. Right there, a woman who refused to disappear, and a man who refused to look away, and everything that became possible the moment those 2 refusals found each other on a dusty platform in the summer of 1884 and decided, without knowing it yet, to become something the territory had never seen before and would not soon forget.